Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the darkest corridors of royal history, where a single bite of the wrong food could seal your fate forever. But here's my question for you. Would you survive a royal dinner where reaching for bread at the wrong moment could cost you your life? Because tonight, we're diving into dining rules so deadly, so bizarre, that they make our worst table manner mistakes look like nothing. If you love discovering these shocking royal secrets, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover some dinner table horrors that will change how you think about eating forever. Imagine living in a world where every meal could be your last meal. That's exactly what life was like in the royal courts, where dining wasn't about food, it was about survival. Let me take you to the court of King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. According to the Duke of Saint-Simon's memoirs, every meal was a deadly performance. Picture this, you're sitting at a golden table, stomach growling, but you cannot, and I mean absolutely cannot, touch your food until the king takes his first bite. But here's the terrifying part. If you were caught even looking hungry while waiting, you could be banished forever. Saint-Simon wrote about a young courtier who was exiled simply because he licked his lips while waiting. One moment of human hunger destroyed his entire life. Could you keep a straight face if your life depended on it? Now let's travel to ancient Rome under Emperor Caligula, where dinner rules weren't just strict, they were deadly. The historian Suetonius documented what Caligula called his divine dining decrees. Picture yourself as his dinner guest, marble columns, golden plates, but pure terror in the air. Here's the rule that'll shock you. If Caligula declared any dish sacred during the meal, anyone who had already eaten it had to purge it from their system immediately. And I'm talking about forced, violent purging that many didn't survive. Suetonius tells us about Senator Marcus, who bit into roasted peacock moments before Caligula declared it sacred. Marcus was forced to drink a purging mixture. He lived, but barely. Others weren't so lucky. Would you dare eat at this table? But wait, if this story shocked you, imagine what's coming next, because we haven't even gotten to the paranoia part yet. Emperor Caligula's ultimate dining rule was born from his fear of poison. Every dish needed a food taster, usually a slave. But here's the cruel twist. If the taster died and the food was poisoned, anyone who had suggested that dish would also be executed for being part of the plot. Think about that psychological torture. Every food suggestion could be your death sentence. Can you imagine choosing what to serve when each choice might be your last? Now let's jump to medieval England, where King Henry VIII took deadly dining to a whole new level. According to Thomas Cromwell's preserved letters, Henry created the mirror rule. Whatever the king ate, you had to eat the exact same thing at the exact same pace. If Henry took 3 bites of lamb, you took 3 bites. If he paused for wine, you paused for wine. Fall behind even by 1 bite, that's treason. Cromwell wrote about young Thomas Fitzgerald at a Christmas feast in 1536. Henry was eating unusually fast that night, and Fitzgerald couldn't keep up. He fell behind by just 1 bite. Henry accused him of deliberately avoiding the food, suggesting he knew it was poisoned. Fitzgerald was executed 3 days later for treasonous dining behaviour. A man lost his life because he chewed too slowly. Let that sink in. But here's what haunts me most about these stories. Food, something we do without thinking, became a constant performance of loyalty. Every bite was a test. Every meal was potentially your final exam. And you know what's really chilling? Some people followed these rules even when the ruler wasn't there. The fear became part of their DNA. Dr. Sarah Bradford explains in Royal Tables, Power and Politics that these weren't just crazy rules, They were psychological warfare designed to maintain absolute control through the most basic human need: eating. The next time you sit down for a casual meal, maybe appreciate the simple freedom of eating at your own pace, choosing your own food and not worrying that dinner might kill you. But our journey through royal madness is just beginning. Next, we're stepping into the most private spaces of royal life, the bathroom. Yes, you heard right. Because believe it or not, even going to the toilet was governed by rules so invasive, so bizarre, that they make our dining disasters look like picnics. So if you want to know why even using the bathroom could cost you your life in a royal palace, don't miss the next part. And hit that bell so you'll be the first to discover just how far royal control really went. Trust me, you won't believe what we uncover next. Now, if you thought dining rules were invasive, prepare yourself for something that will make you grateful for every private bathroom moment you've ever had. Because we're about to enter the most intimate chambers of royal palaces, where even your most personal moments became public performances. Here's a question that might make you uncomfortable. Who watched you the last time you used the bathroom? Hopefully the answer is nobody, but for royalty throughout history, privacy was a luxury they simply couldn't afford, even in the toilet. Welcome to the bizarre world of royal bathroom etiquette, where going to the toilet became a ceremony more complex than some weddings, and where the wrong move could literally flush your life away. Let's start with the most shocking example, the court of King Louis XIV at Versailles. Now you might think the Sun King would want privacy during his most vulnerable moments. You'd be completely wrong. According to the detailed court records kept by the Marquise de Maintenon, Louis XIV's morning toilet routine, and yes, I mean his actual toilet time, was one of the most attended events of the day. Picture this scene. It's 7 a.m. at Versailles. The king wakes up and immediately a parade of courtiers begins filing into his private chambers. The Duc de Saint-Saëns documented that up to 30 people would crowd into the king's bathroom to watch him, well, do his business. This wasn't considered weird or inappropriate, it was considered an honour. But here's where it gets really strange. There was a strict hierarchy for who could watch what. According to Maintenon's memoirs, only the highest-ranking dukes could observe the king's entire toilet routine. Lesser nobles could only watch him wash his hands. And commoners? They weren't even allowed to know which bathroom the king was using. Can you imagine having 30 people staring at you during your morning routine? The psychological pressure must have been incredible. But wait, it gets weirder. The person who handed the king his toilet paper held one of the most coveted positions in the entire palace. This role, called Groom of the Stool, was so prestigious that nobles would literally fight duels for the privilege. Saint-Simon wrote about 2 counts who had a sword fight in 1697 over who would have the honour of handing Louis XIV his toilet paper. Think about that. Men died for the right to be present during the king's bathroom breaks. Now, let's cross the English Channel to see how the British royalty handled their toilet etiquette. King Henry VIII, not surprisingly, took bathroom paranoia to deadly new levels. According to Thomas Cromwell's confidential letters to Cardinal Wolsey, Henry created what he called the Sacred Chamber Protocol. Here's how insane this was. Henry was so paranoid about being assassinated during vulnerable moments that he required 3 separate people to be present whenever he used the toilet. 1 person to guard the door, 1 to watch his back, and 1 to taste test his toilet water before he used it. Yes, you heard that right. Someone had to taste the water that would be used for the king's bathroom needs, just to make sure it wasn't poisoned. Cromwell documented that this job had an average life expectancy of about 2 years, because the constant exposure to potentially contaminated water eventually killed most of the taste testers. But Henry's bathroom paranoia didn't stop there. He also required that his toilet paper be blessed by a priest before each use, and that any leftover paper be burned immediately afterward to prevent enemies from using it for dark magic against him. I can't help but wonder, how do you even explain that job to someone? Congratulations, you're the new royal toilet paper blessing specialist. The historian Alison Weir, in her comprehensive study Henry VIII, the King and His Court, documented an incident where Henry had a servant executed because the man accidentally saw the king's bathroom routine through a keyhole. The servant was charged with unlawful observation of royal privacy and beheaded 3 days later. A man lost his life for accidentally seeing something that 30 people watched voluntarily in France. The inconsistency of royal logic is truly mind-boggling. But perhaps the most elaborate bathroom etiquette existed in imperial China. According to the Ming Dynasty court records translated by Dr. Ray Huang in 1587, a year of no significance, the emperor's toilet routine was so complex it required a written manual, yes, an actual instruction book, that was over 40 pages long. The Chinese emperor's bathroom had 7 different rooms, each serving a specific purpose in the toilet ritual. Room 1 was for meditation before the act. Room 2 was for removing the outer garments. Room 3 was for removing the inner garments. Room 4 was for the actual business. Room 5 was for the cleaning ritual. Room 6 was for redressing. And Room 7 was for a final cleansing ceremony. Each room had its own set of attendants, its own specific protocols, and its own potential punishments for mistakes. Dr. Huang's research shows that the entire process could take up to 2 hours, depending on the emperor's mood and the complexity of the day's ceremony. Here's the part that will shock you. If any attendant made a mistake in any of these 7 rooms, dropped something, moved at the wrong time, looked in the wrong direction, they weren't just fired. According to the court records, they were sentenced to become permanent toilet cleaners for the rest of their lives, cleaning the latrines of common soldiers. Imagine ruining your entire future because you handed someone toilet paper with your left hand instead of your right hand, but the Chinese weren't done yet. The Forbidden City records, preserved in the Palace Museum archives, reveal that the emperor's bathroom habits were tracked with scientific precision. Every toilet visit was recorded, the time, the duration, the attendants present, and even detailed descriptions of, well, let's just say they monitored everything. Why such obsessive record keeping? Because the emperor's digestive health was considered a direct reflection of the kingdom's spiritual health. If the emperor was constipated, it meant the kingdom was blocked from prosperity. If he had stomach troubles, it meant rebellion was coming. These bathroom records were actually used to make major political decisions. Can you imagine if our modern leaders' bathroom habits determined foreign policy? Actually, don't answer that. Now here's where royal bathroom etiquette gets truly dangerous. In the court of Tsar Ivan the Terrible, documented by the chronicler Heinrich von Staden, bathroom time became an opportunity for assassination attempts. Ivan was so paranoid that he created rotating bathroom schedules, different toilets, different times, different routes to get there, to confuse potential killers. But Ivan's paranoia led to a tragic mistake. Von Staden wrote about an incident in 1570 where Ivan, in his confusion about his own rotating schedule, walked into the wrong bathroom at the wrong time. He found a servant cleaning the toilet and, convinced this was an assassination attempt, had the poor man tortured and executed on the spot. The servant was literally just doing his job, cleaning a toilet. But because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time in Ivan's paranoid system, he paid with his life. What strikes me most about these stories is how something as basic and universal as using the bathroom became a stage for displaying power, conducting politics, and unfortunately ending lives. These weren't just weird habits, they were carefully designed systems of control and intimidation. Think about this. In our modern world, the bathroom is the one place where we're truly alone, truly private. For these historical rulers, privacy itself was seen as dangerous, as a moment of vulnerability that needed to be filled with witnesses, ceremonies, and protocols. The irony is incredible. The more powerful these rulers became, the less privacy they had. They gained the ability to control entire kingdoms, but lost the simple human dignity of using the toilet alone. But as bizarre and invasive as these bathroom rules were, they pale in comparison to what we're about to explore next. Because when it comes to matters of the heart, royal rules didn't just invade privacy, they completely rewrote the meaning of love itself. We're about to discover how falling in love became the most dangerous thing you could do in a royal court, where a single kiss could start wars, and where choosing the wrong person to love didn't just break hearts, it literally broke their necks. The forbidden love rules of royal history make our modern dating drama look like child's play, and some of these romantic restrictions were so extreme they changed the course of entire civilizations. Speaking of hearts being broken, let's talk about how royal love rules didn't just break hearts, they literally broke necks. In the world of royal courts, falling in love was the most dangerous gamble you could take, where a stolen kiss could cost you your head, and marrying for love instead of politics could topple entire kingdoms. Here's something to think about. Have you ever been told you're dating the wrong person? Well, imagine if dating the wrong person meant facing the executioner's axe. Because in royal history, love wasn't just personal, it was a political weapon that could destroy lives with a single heartbeat. Let's dive into the most tragic love story you've probably never heard of. One that shows just how deadly royal romance could be. Our story begins in 1536, in the court of King Henry VIII, where a young woman named Catherine Howard caught the king's eye. But according to the meticulous court records kept by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Catherine had a secret that would seal her fate. She'd been in love before. Now you might think, so what? People have past relationships. But under Henry's twisted love laws, any woman who married the king had to be, let's say, completely inexperienced in matters of the heart. The rule was called the Purity Doctrine, and it stated that anyone who had shown affection to the queen before her marriage to the king was guilty of treason. Catherine's crime: she'd exchanged love letters with a young musician named Henry Mannix when she was just 13 years old. Cranmer's archives show these were innocent teenage letters, things like, "I think of you when I hear music," and "Your smile makes me happy." But when Henry VIII discovered these letters, he didn't see innocent young love. He saw treason. According to Cranmer's detailed account, Henry declared that anyone who had stolen the affections that rightfully belonged to the king was guilty of theft of royal property. Can you imagine being executed for writing a love letter when you were 13? Both Catherine and Henry Mannix were beheaded in February 1542. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. Henry VIII also executed everyone who knew about the letters and didn't report them. Catherine's friends, her tutors, even the servant who delivered the letters. 13 people lost their lives because 2 teenagers had written innocent love notes to each other. Cranmer wrote in his private diary preserved in the British Library, "I watched a king destroy love itself, turning affection into a capital crime." The psychological impact on the court was devastating. People became afraid to show any emotion at all. But Henry VIII wasn't the only monarch who turned love into a death sentence. Let's travel to France, where the Sun King Louis XIV created what might be the most controlling love laws in history. According to the memoirs of Madame de Sévigné, one of the court's most observant witnesses, Louis XIV instituted the Royal Romance Regulations in 1661. These weren't just suggestions, they were life or death commandments that governed every aspect of romantic expression in Versailles. Here's how extreme these rules were. You couldn't look at someone you found attractive for more than 3 seconds without official permission. Sévigné documented the court employing love watchers, servants whose only job was to time how long people looked at each other and report any violations. But the most shocking rule was this: if you fell in love with someone, you had exactly 24 hours to report your feelings to the king. Not reporting romantic feelings was considered emotional treason, punishable by exile or death. Sévigné wrote about a young count named Philippe who fell in love with a duchess. He was so overwhelmed by his feelings that he forgot to report them within the 24-hour window. When Louis IV discovered the romance 3 days later, Philippe was stripped of his titles and banished from France forever. He died in poverty in England, never seeing his homeland again. How do you put a timer on falling in love? The psychological pressure must have been unbearable. But wait, there's more. Louis XIV also banned certain types of romantic gestures entirely. According to the court records in the Archives Nationales, these banned romantic acts included writing poetry about someone's ease, considered too intimate, giving flowers, seen as a declaration of intent, and, this one's incredible, walking in step with someone you liked, because synchronized walking was considered a form of physical courtship. Can you imagine being arrested for walking at the same pace as your crush? Sévigné documented a case where a young woman named Marie was executed because she unconsciously matched her walking rhythm to a man she admired during a court procession. She wasn't even aware she was doing it, but the love watchers noticed, reported it, and Louis XIV declared it an act of unlawful romantic synchronization. Now let's journey to Imperial Russia, where Tsar Ivan the Terrible created perhaps the most bizarre love laws in history. According to the chronicler Andrei Kurbsky, who fled Ivan's court and wrote extensive memoirs about the Tsar's madness, Ivan believed that love was a form of treason against the state. Here's Ivan's twisted logic. If you loved someone, you cared more about them than about serving the Tsar. Therefore, love was a divided loyalty, and divided loyalty was treason. Kurbsky documented Ivan's love detection tests. These were actual interrogations where suspected lovers were brought before the Tsar and asked questions like, "If I ordered you to execute this person you claim to love, would you do it immediately?" If you hesitated even for a second, you were both executed for emotional treason. But here's the most chilling part of Ivan's love laws. He institutionalized something called love proving. If 2 people were suspected of being in love, they were forced to torture each other to prove their loyalty to the Tsar was stronger than their love for each other. Kurbsky wrote about a couple named Dmitri and Anna who were caught holding hands. Ivan gave Dmitri a choice: torture Anna himself to prove his loyalty to the state was stronger than his love for her, or watch Ivan torture them both. Dmitri, trying to spare Anna worse suffering, chose to do it himself. They both died during the love-proving session. Reading these accounts, I can't help but think, Ivan didn't just destroy love, he weaponized it, turning the most beautiful human emotion into an instrument of torture. Would you be strong enough to survive in a world where love itself was illegal? But perhaps the most tragic love story comes from ancient Egypt, where even the gods couldn't protect lovers from deadly royal rules. According to the papyrus records translated by Dr. Joanne Fletcher in The Search for Nefertiti, Pharaoh Akhenaten created laws that made it illegal for anyone except the royal family to express love publicly. The rule was called divine love monopoly. The belief that since the pharaoh was a living god, all love in the kingdom belonged to him. Citizens could marry for practical purposes, but any display of genuine affection was considered theft of divine emotion. Dr. Fletcher's research reveals the story of a young scribe named Amenhotep who wrote a love poem for his wife. The poem was discovered by royal inspectors during a routine home search. Amenhotep and his wife were both buried alive as punishment for stealing divine love. But here's what makes this story even more heartbreaking. Archaeologists found the poem carved into the wall of their tomb. Even facing death, Amenhotep used his final moments to complete his love poem. The last line, translated by Dr. Fletcher, reads, "Even in death, my heart beats only for you." Imagine loving someone so much that you use your dying breath to finish a poem for them. These stories reveal something profound about human nature. Love is so fundamental, so powerful that people were willing to die for it even when they knew the consequences. In a world where showing affection could cost you your life, people still chose love. But what strikes me most is how these rulers tried to control the uncontrollable. They could control where people walked, what they ate, how they used the bathroom. But love found a way, even in the face of death. The tragic irony is that by trying to monopolize love, these rulers destroyed the very thing they claimed to possess. Their courts became places of fear, suspicion, and loneliness, where genuine human connection became impossible. Dr. Helen Castor, in her study Blood and Roses, the Paston Family in the 15th century, observed that courts with the strictest love laws often had the highest rates of mental illness, suicide, and rebellion. When you criminalize the human heart, you create a society that's fundamentally broken. As we reflect on these devastating love stories, remember this. Every time you freely choose who to love, every time you express affection without fear, every time you write a love letter or hold someone's hand, you're exercising a freedom that people literally died for throughout history. But if you think controlling love was extreme, wait until you discover how royal courts regulated something even more basic than emotion, the simple act of walking. Because coming up, we're exploring how your footsteps could start wars, how the wrong stride could cost you your life, and why some kings required people to walk backwards in their presence. The sacred walking laws of royal courts will make you appreciate every step you take freely, and show you how even the ground beneath your feet became a battlefield for power and control. Every step you take is a choice you make freely, but what if I told you that throughout history, the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other could trigger international incidents, spark bloody wars, or cost you your head? Welcome to the absolutely bizarre world of sacred walking laws, where your stride, your direction, even the sound of your footsteps became matters of life and death. Think about this. How many steps have you taken today without thinking about it? 1,000? 5,000? Now imagine if each one of those steps had to be calculated, measured, and approved by someone else, because the wrong step could literally end your life. Let me take you back to the Forbidden City in Beijing during the Ming Dynasty, where Emperor Wanli created what historians call the most complex walking regulations in human history. According to the detailed court records translated by Dr. Ray Huang in 1587, a year of no significance, there were over 200 different walking rules that governed how people moved through the palace. But here's the rule that'll blow your mind. Depending on your rank, you were only allowed to take a specific number of steps per minute in the emperor's presence. High-ranking officials could take 60 steps per minute. Lower officials were limited to 45 steps per minute. And commoners, if they were even allowed in the palace, could only take 30 steps per minute. Dr. Huang's research reveals that the palace employed step counters, servants whose only job was to follow people around and count their steps, timing them with water clocks. If you exceeded your step allowance, you were immediately arrested for stride treason. Can you imagine having someone follow you around counting every step you take? The psychological pressure would be incredible, but it gets even more bizarre. According to the Ming Court archives preserved in the Palace Museum, Different areas of the Forbidden City required different walking styles. In the Hall of Supreme Harmony, you had to walk with your feet pointing slightly inward, what they called humble stepping. In the Emperor's private quarters, you had to walk completely backwards, never turning your back on the imperial presence. The court records document a tragic incident from 1587 where a young translator named Chen Wei forgot the walking rules during an important diplomatic meeting. He was escorting foreign ambassadors and, in his nervousness, took 61 steps per minute instead of the required 60. The step counter immediately reported the violation. Emperor Wanli was so enraged by this disrespectful haste that he declared it an insult to China's dignity in front of foreign representatives. Chen Wei was executed the next day, and the diplomatic incident nearly caused a war with Korea. One extra step per minute started an international crisis. Let that sink in. Now let's walk our way to France, where King Louis XIV turned walking into an art form so complex it required years of training. According to the memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, who spent decades observing court life at Versailles, Louis XIV believed that how people walked revealed their true character and loyalty. Saint-Simon documented Louis XIV's sacred stride ceremony, which happened every morning at exactly 9 a.m. The king would emerge from his chambers and begin walking through the Palace of Versailles. And here's the incredible part. Everyone in the palace had to adjust their walking to match his pace and style. If Louis XIV walked quickly, everyone walked quickly. If he slowed down, everyone slowed down. If he paused to admire a painting, everyone had to pause at exactly the same moment. Saint-Simon wrote that this created an eerie, synchronized movement throughout the entire palace. Hundreds of people moving as one organism, controlled by the king's footsteps. But here's where it became deadly. According to Saint-Simon's detailed observations, there were courtiers called pace judges who watched everyone's walking form during these ceremonies. If your stride was too confident, you were accused of arrogance. If it was too hesitant, you were suspected of plotting. If you accidentally stepped out of a rhythm with the king, you were guilty of rebellious walking. Saint-Simon documented the case of Count Philippe de Lorraine, who in 1682 accidentally took one step ahead of the king during a ceremonial walk. Louis XIV interpreted this as Philippe trying to lead him, which was considered an act of symbolic rebellion. Philippe was stripped of his titles and exiled from France forever. One misplaced step cost a man everything he had. How's that for pressure? Do you think you could handle walking under that kind of scrutiny every single day? But perhaps the most extreme walking laws existed in the court of Tsar Peter the Great of Russia. According to the detailed chronicles kept by Johann Georg Korb, an Austrian diplomat who witnessed Peter's court firsthand, the Tsar created walking rules that were designed to literally reshape Russian society. Korb's Diary of an Austrian Secretary of Legation reveals that Peter the Great banned traditional Russian walking styles, which he considered backwards and primitive. Instead, he mandated that all nobles learn European walking techniques, longer strides, straight backs, and synchronized arm movements. But here's the shocking part. Peter hired French dancing masters to teach Russians how to walk properly. According to Korb's eyewitness account, these weren't optional lessons. Nobles who failed their walking examinations were sent to forced labor camps in Siberia. Korb documented the story of Prince Vasily Dolgorukov, who was in his 60s and struggled to learn the new walking style due to arthritis. When he failed his third walking examination, Peter the Great declared him unfit for modern Russian society and sentenced him to 10 years of hard labor. Dolgorukov died in the labor camp within 6 months. An elderly man died because he couldn't learn to walk like a Frenchman. The absurdity is heartbreaking, but Peter's walking obsession went even further. Korb wrote that Peter instituted walking inspections in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Royal inspectors would randomly stop people on the street and examine their stride. If you were caught walking in the old Russian style, you were fined, beaten, or imprisoned. Think about this. Peter the Great literally tried to change an entire nation's culture through walking. And it worked. Within a generation, traditional Russian walking styles had almost completely disappeared. The psychological impact of these walking laws was devastating. When you can't even move naturally without fear of punishment, you lose a fundamental part of your humanity. Now, let's travel to ancient Persia, where the walking laws of King Xerxes created some of the most bizarre diplomatic incidents in history. According to Herodotus in his Histories, Xerxes believed that how foreign ambassadors walked in his presence revealed their nation's true intentions toward Persia. Herodotus documented Xerxes' walking truth test. When foreign diplomats arrived at his court, they were required to walk a specific path through the throne room, while Xerxes observed their stride, posture, and foot placement. Based on how they walked, Xerxes would decide whether their nation was friend or foe. Here's how crazy this was. If an ambassador walked too confidently, Xerxes interpreted it as arrogance and a sign that their nation was planning to attack Persia. If they walked too humbly, he saw it as weakness and decided their nation would be easy to conquer. If they walked normally, he suspected they were hiding something. Herodotus wrote about the Greek ambassador Aristagoras, who in 499 BC was trying to secure Persian support against the Spartans. During his walking test, Aristagoras tried to walk normally, but Xerxes declared his stride suspiciously balanced, indicating that Greece was playing both sides. This walking interpretation led Xerxes to conclude that Greece was an enemy, contributing to his decision to invade. Herodotus suggests that the massive Persian invasion of Greece, which led to the famous battles of Marathon and Thermopylae, might have been partly triggered by how one man walked across a room. Can you imagine if modern diplomacy worked this way? Sorry, we're going to war because your ambassador had suspicious posture. But here's what fascinates me most about these walking laws. They reveal how desperate these rulers were to control every aspect of human behavior. Walking is one of our most basic instinctive activities. When you regulate how people walk, you're literally controlling their most fundamental movements. Dr. Barbara Hannawalt, in her study Growing Up in Medieval London, observed that societies with strict walking laws often had higher rates of anxiety disorders and what we would now recognize as PTSD symptoms. When your body can't move naturally, your mind suffers too. The tragedy is that these walking laws often achieve the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of creating order and respect, they created fear, resentment, and rebellion. People who are afraid to walk naturally are people who are planning revolution. What strikes me is how these stories show the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Even when their most basic movements were controlled, people found ways to resist, to maintain their dignity, to remain human, despite dehumanizing circumstances. Every time you walk freely down the street, every time you choose your own pace, every time you move without counting steps or worrying about who's watching, you're exercising a freedom that people throughout history literally died for. But as controlling as these walking laws were, they're nothing compared to what's coming next. Because if you think regulating footsteps was extreme, wait until you discover how royal courts controlled something even more personal, the very face you showed to the world. We're about to explore beauty standards so deadly, makeup rules so toxic, and cosmetic requirements so extreme that looking beautiful could literally kill you. The murderous makeup laws of royal history will make you grateful for every natural, unregulated breath you take. Beauty has always been powerful, but what if I told you that throughout history, the pursuit of royal beauty standards didn't just hurt? It literally killed. We're about to uncover a world where looking beautiful was a death sentence, where the wrong shade of rouge could end your life, and where makeup became the most elegant murder weapon ever created. Here's a question that might chill you. What's the deadliest thing in your makeup bag? Hopefully, nothing. But for people in royal courts throughout history, every cosmetic was potentially lethal, and beauty itself became a carefully orchestrated form of slow suicide. Let's begin with perhaps the most shocking example: the court of Queen Elizabeth of England, where beauty standards literally ate people alive from the inside out. According to Dr. Anna Whitelock's meticulously researched Elizabeth's Bedfellows, the Queen's famous porcelain white complexion wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a deadly mandate that killed hundreds of women. The makeup Elizabeth required was called Venetian ceruse, and here's the terrifying part. It was made primarily of white lead and vinegar. Dr. Whitelock's analysis of court records shows that this makeup didn't just sit on the skin, it absorbed into the bloodstream, causing lead poisoning that manifested as hair loss, tooth decay, and eventually agonizing death. But here's what makes this truly horrific. Elizabeth made wearing this deadly makeup mandatory for all women in her court. According to the detailed diary of Lady Anne Clifford, preserved in the Cumbria Archive Centre, any woman who appeared before the Queen without the proper white complexion was accused of insulting the royal standard of beauty and could be banished or worse. Lady Clifford documented the slow death of her friend, Lady Margaret Howard, who died at age 23 from lead poisoning after 2 years of wearing Venetian ceruse daily. Clifford wrote, "I watched Margaret's beauty consume her life, one layer of white death at a time. Her teeth fell out, her hair came away in clumps, yet still she painted her face each morning, for to appear before Her Majesty without it meant exile or execution." Can you imagine being forced to poison yourself daily just to look acceptable? But the deadly makeup didn't stop with the face. Dr. Whitelock's research reveals that Elizabeth's court also mandated a rouge made from mercury and sulfur for the lips and cheeks. Mercury, as we now know, causes severe neurological damage leading to tremors, memory loss, and eventually death. The court records show that by 1590, over 200 women in Elizabeth's court were suffering from what they called beauty sickness, the collective term for lead and mercury poisoning from cosmetics. Yet the makeup requirements remained unchanged because Elizabeth herself was so addicted to these deadly cosmetics that she couldn't bear to see natural skin in her presence. Lady Clifford wrote that Elizabeth's own face had become so damaged by years of lead makeup that she required increasingly thick layers to hide the destruction. The Queen's face had become a mask of white lead, Clifford observed, and she forced us all to wear the same death mask, lest our healthy skin remind her of what she had lost. Now, let's travel to the court of Louis IV in France, where beauty standards became even more elaborate and equally deadly. According to the detailed memoirs of Madame de Maintenon, the Sun King's court required women to achieve what was called the porcelain perfection, a beauty standard so extreme it required multiple layers of toxic cosmetics. Maintenon documented the daily beauty routine required for court ladies. First, a base layer of white lead mixed with egg whites. Second, rouge made from cinnabar, a mercury compound. Third, eye makeup made from antimony, a toxic metal. And finally, lip colour made from vermilion, which contained more mercury. But here's where Louis IV's beauty standards became truly sadistic. According to Maintenon's private letters, preserved in the Archives Nationales, the king instituted beauty inspections every morning at 10 a.m. Court ladies had to present themselves for examination, and any woman whose makeup wasn't perfect was forced to remove it all and start over, meaning they absorbed even more poison into their skin. Maintenton wrote about the Duchess of Burgundy, who died at age 27 after failing a beauty inspection and being forced to reapply her toxic makeup 3 times in one day. I watched Marie Adélaïde remove layer after layer of poison, only to paint herself with death once again, Maintenon recorded. The king's pursuit of perfection became her pursuit of the grave. The psychological pressure was as deadly as the physical poison. These women knew the makeup was killing them, but appearing without it meant social death, exile, or worse. Do you think you could choose between certain death and social destruction? Which would be worse? But perhaps the most extreme beauty standards existed in Imperial China, where the practice of foot binding wasn't just about beauty, it was about creating a specific type of suffering that proved your dedication to imperial ideals. According to Dr. Dorothy Coe's comprehensive study, Cinderella's Sisters, a revisionist history of foot binding, this practice was far more deadly than most people realize. Dr. Coe's research, based on Qing dynasty medical records, reveals that foot binding didn't just create small feet, it created a specific type of disability that prevented women from escaping their circumstances. The process involved breaking every toe except the big toe, then binding the foot so tightly that the broken bones would heal in a deformed position. But here's the part that will shock you. According to imperial court records translated by Dr. Coe, foot binding was mandatory for any woman who wanted to marry into the imperial family or serve in the palace. The Kangxi Emperor issued an edict in 1668 stating that any woman with natural feet was unsuitable for civilized society and could not hold any position in the imperial court. Dr. Coe documented the foot binding process had a mortality rate of approximately 10%, meaning 1 in 10 girls died during the binding process from infection, gangrene, or sepsis. But even surviving the initial binding was just the beginning. The court records show that women with bound feet had drastically shortened lifespans due to mobility limitations, circulation problems, and chronic infection. The Imperial Beauty Manual, preserved in the Forbidden City archives, described the perfect foot as being exactly 3 inches long and shaped like a lotus bud. To achieve this, Dr. Coe's research shows that the binding process often required re-breaking the feet multiple times if they didn't heal in the correct shape. But here's the most chilling aspect. According to the court records, the Kangxi Emperor himself never actually saw the bound feet of the women in his court. The entire practice, the pain, the deaths, the disability, was based on an abstract ideal of beauty that the person enforcing it never even witnessed. Think about this. Generations of women suffered and died for a beauty standard that existed only in one man's imagination. Now let's explore the deadly cosmetics of ancient Egypt, where Cleopatra's famous beauty routine was literally killing her. According to the papyrus documents translated by Dr. Joanne Fletcher in Cleopatra the Great, the Queen's iconic eye makeup was made from galena, a lead-based mineral that's highly toxic. Dr. Fletcher's analysis of mummy remains from the Ptolemaic period reveals that Egyptian royalty had some of the highest levels of lead poisoning ever recorded in ancient populations. The famous kohl eyeliner that we associate with Egyptian beauty contained not just lead, but also antimony and mercury compounds. But Cleopatra took deadly beauty to an extreme level. According to the writings of Pliny the Elder, preserved in his Natural History, Cleopatra used a lipstick made from crushed carmine beetles mixed with ant eggs and human saliva. This combination created a red colour that lasted all day, but it also contained parasites and bacteria that caused severe mouth infections. Pliny documented that Cleopatra's pursuit of the perfect red lips led to chronic oral infections that eventually spread to her throat and respiratory system. Dr. Fletcher's research suggests that Cleopatra's famous beauty routine may have significantly contributed to her death at age 39, far younger than the average lifespan for Egyptian royalty. But here's what makes Cleopatra's story even more tragic. According to Roman historian Dio Cassius, she knew her cosmetics were poisonous. In his Roman history, Dio Cassius wrote that Cleopatra tested various poisons on condemned prisoners, including the ingredients in her own makeup. She knew exactly how toxic her beauty routine was, but continued using it because political power depended on maintaining her legendary appearance. Can you imagine knowingly poisoning yourself every day because your political survival depended on looking perfect? The psychological toll of these beauty standards was devastating. Dr. Sarah Bond, in her study Trade and Taboo in the Roman World, found evidence that many women in royal courts suffered from what we would now recognize as body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and severe anxiety related to their appearance. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these deadly beauty standards is how they turned women against each other. When survival depended on being more beautiful than the competition, cooperation became impossible. Madame de Maintenon wrote about the beauty wars at Versailles, where women would sabotage each other's cosmetics, adding extra mercury or lead to rivals' makeup. "We became assassins armed with rouge and powder," she observed, killing each other slowly in the name of beauty. What strikes me most about these stories is how beauty, something that should celebrate human creativity and self-expression, became a weapon of control and destruction. These rulers didn't just control how people looked, they controlled their willingness to suffer and die for arbitrary standards. The tragedy is that these women often knew they were being slowly killed by their beauty routines, but the alternative, social death, exile, or execution, seemed worse than physical death. They chose to die beautifully rather than live as outcasts. Every time you put on makeup without fear, every time you choose your own beauty standards, every time you feel comfortable in your natural skin, you're exercising a freedom that countless women throughout history literally died trying to achieve. But as devastating as these beauty standards were, they pale in comparison to the rules we're about to explore. Because coming up, we're diving into inheritance laws so twisted, so cruel, that being born became the most dangerous thing you could do. We're about to discover how the circumstances of your birth could seal your fate before you took your first breath, and why some royal children were executed simply for existing. The insane inheritance laws of royal history will show you that sometimes the greatest crime was simply being born at the wrong time, to the wrong parents, in the wrong order. Birth should be the most joyful moment in any family's life, but imagine a world where the circumstances of your birth could sentence you to death before you even opened your eyes. Throughout royal history, inheritance laws became so twisted, so brutal, that children were executed simply for existing, and families were torn apart by rules that made survival a deadly lottery. Stop and think about this. What was the first thing that determined your place in this world? Probably your parents, maybe the order you were born, perhaps where you came from. Now imagine if any one of those factors, things completely beyond your control, could have meant an immediate death sentence. We're diving into inheritance laws so insane that they turned royal families into battlegrounds, where brothers killed brothers, mothers poisoned daughters, and being born at the wrong time meant you'd never see your first birthday. Let's start with perhaps the most shocking example. The Ottoman Empire's law of fratricide, which literally legalized the murder of royal children. According to the detailed chronicles of Dmitry Cantemir in The History of the Growth and Decay of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Mehmed II institutionalized something called the Law of Survival in 1453. Here's how terrifyingly simple this law was. When a sultan died, whichever of his sons seized the throne first had the legal right, no, the legal obligation, to execute all of his brothers, every single one. Cantemir documented that this wasn't considered murder. It was considered preventing civil war through decisive action. But here's the part that will chill you to the bone. According to Cantemir's eyewitness accounts, these weren't quick, merciful executions. The new sultan had to personally strangle each of his brothers with a silk bowstring as a demonstration of his willingness to prioritize the empire over family bonds. Cantemir wrote about the succession of Sultan Bayezid II in 1481, where the new sultan had to execute 7 of his own brothers, ranging in age from 8 to 23 years old. I witnessed a brother weep as he placed the silk cord around his youngest brother's neck, Cantemir recorded. The child asked why, and Bayezid could only whisper, "Because you were born." Can you imagine having to kill your own family members just to keep your throne? The psychological trauma must have been unbearable. But the Ottoman law got even more brutal. According to the palace records preserved in the Topkapi Museum archives, translated by historian Leslie Pearce in The Imperial Harem, if a sultan died without clearly naming an heir, all of his sons would fight to the death, with the survivor becoming the new ruler. Dr. Pearce documented the succession crisis of 1603, when Sultan Mehmed III died suddenly. His 4 sons, Ahmed, Mustafa, Mahmud and Selim, were locked in the palace together until only one remained alive. The brothers fought with swords, poison and strangulation for 3 days. Ahmed emerged as the sole survivor and became Sultan Ahmed IV, but palace servants reported that he never spoke his brothers' names again for the rest of his life. 3 young men died simply because their father didn't write down which one should inherit the throne. The randomness of it is heartbreaking. Now let's travel to medieval England, where Henry VIII created inheritance laws that were equally deadly but far more psychological in their cruelty. According to the detailed analysis by historian David Starkey in 6 Wives, the Queens of Henry VIII, Henry didn't just execute his wives, he retroactively declared their children illegitimate, which in Tudor law meant they had no right to exist. Here's how twisted Henry's logic became. When he divorced Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, he declared that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid. This automatically made their daughter Mary illegitimate. But when he later executed Anne Boleyn, he declared that marriage invalid too, making Elizabeth illegitimate as well. Starkey's research reveals that being declared illegitimate wasn't just about inheritance. It was a legal death sentence disguised as a legal technicality. Illegitimate royal children could be executed at any time for existing unlawfully, or corrupting the royal bloodline. The psychological torture Henry inflicted on his children was devastating. According to the private letters of Lady Jane Rochford, preserved in the British Library, both Mary and Elizabeth lived in constant terror of execution. "The Princess Mary weeps each night," Rochford wrote in 1536, "for she knows not if the sunrise will bring legitimacy or the headsman's axe." But Henry's cruelest inheritance law was what Starkey calls the conditional existence doctrine. According to the Succession Act of 1534, Henry's children only had the right to live as long as they didn't challenge his authority or remarry without his permission. Essentially, their right to exist was conditional on perfect obedience. Would you be able to sleep at night knowing your right to live depended on never making your father angry? Now let's examine the Byzantine Empire, where inheritance laws reached levels of complexity that would make modern tax codes look simple. According to the detailed study by historian Warren Treadgold in A History of the Byzantine State and Society, Byzantine emperors created something called the purple-born succession, which determined your right to inherit based on incredibly specific circumstances of your birth. Treadgold's research reveals that only children born in the Purple Chamber, a specific room in the Great Palace of Constantinople with purple marble walls, could legally inherit the throne. But here's the catch. If the emperor wasn't physically present in the palace when you were born, you weren't considered legitimate, even if you were born in the Purple Chamber. This led to some absolutely absurd situations. Treadgold documented the case of Prince Constantine Lascaris in 1204, whose father, Emperor Alexios IV, was away fighting a war when Constantine was born. Even though Constantine was born in the Purple Chamber to the Empress, he was declared illegitimate because his father wasn't in the palace at the moment of birth. Constantine spent his entire life fighting for his right to exist. He was eventually executed at age 19 by his own cousin, who argued that Constantine's unlawful birth made him a threat to the legitimate succession. But the Byzantine laws got even more specific. According to the court records preserved in the Vatican secret archives, children had to be born between sunrise and sunset to be considered legitimate. Night births were considered cursed by darkness and automatically excluded from succession. Treadgold documented the tragedy of Princess Elena Komnenos, who was born just 3 minutes after sunset in 1083. Despite being the daughter of Emperor Alexios Eustace, she was declared illegitimate due to the timing of her birth. Anna spent her entire life writing histories and planning rebellions, trying to prove her right to rule despite being born a few minutes too late. Can you imagine losing your birthright because you were born during the wrong time of day? Let's journey to Imperial China, where the inheritance laws of the Qing dynasty created some of the most heartbreaking family tragedies in history. According to the detailed records translated by historian Evelyn Roski in The Last Emperors, the Qing emperors practiced something called the mandate selection, where the emperor would secretly choose his heir from among all his sons, but wouldn't reveal the choice until his deathbed. Rowski's research shows that this system was designed to prevent succession wars, but it created an even worse problem. It turned royal sons into paranoid competitors who lived their entire lives not knowing if they would inherit the throne or be executed by whoever did. The court records document the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, who had 35 sons from various wives and concubines. According to Dr. Rowski's analysis, Kangxi deliberately kept all of his sons in suspense for over 40 years, never giving any indication of who his chosen heir might be. The psychological impact was devastating. Palace servants reported that the princes lived in constant fear, unable to trust each other, unable to form genuine relationships because any of their brothers might become emperor and order their execution. Dr. Rowski documented the tragic story of Prince Yinreng, who was initially named heir apparent, but then spent 20 years watching his father change his mind repeatedly. Kangxi would name Yinreng as heir, then revoke it, then restore it, then revoke it again. The constant uncertainty drove Yinreng to a mental breakdown. When Kangxi finally died in 1722, he named his fourth son Yinzhen as heir. Yinzhen became the Yongzheng emperor and immediately ordered the house arrest or execution of 8 of his brothers, including Yinreng, who died in prison after being confined for 12 years. Think about this. Yinreng spent his entire adult life believing he might become emperor, only to die as a prisoner executed by his own brother. All because of an inheritance system designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. But perhaps the most cruel inheritance law existed in medieval France under the Salic law, which didn't just exclude women from inheritance, It declared that any woman who attempted to claim royal inheritance was guilty of treason against God himself. According to the legal scholar Craig Taylor in the Salic Law and the Valois Succession to the French throne, this law wasn't just about keeping women off the throne, it was about defining them as inherently incapable of legitimate rule. Here's how extreme this became. During the 100 Years' War, the English claimed the French throne partly through female inheritance lines. The French response wasn't just military, it was legal. They declared that any woman who claimed royal inheritance was practicing witchcraft, because only supernatural evil could make a woman believe she could rule. Taylor's research documents the case of Joan of Arc, who wasn't just burned for heresy, she was also charged with unlawful assumption of royal authority because she claimed divine right to restore the French king. Part of her crime was being a woman who acted with royal authority. But the Salic Law created an even more twisted situation. Taylor found evidence that several French princesses were secretly murdered by their own families to prevent them from ever being used as the basis for inheritance claims by foreign powers. Princess Isabel of France, daughter of King Philip IV, was likely poisoned by her own brother in 1358 because the English were using her marriage to Edward II as justification for their claim to the French throne. She wasn't killed for what she did, she was killed for what she represented as a woman in a male-only inheritance system. What strikes me most about these inheritance laws is how they turned families into war zones. Children who should have been protected and nurtured were instead seen as threats to be eliminated. Brothers who should have been allies became deadly enemies. Parents who should have loved unconditionally were forced to choose which of their children deserved to live. These laws reveal something dark about absolute power. When you have everything to lose, everyone becomes a potential threat, even your own family. The inheritance system that was supposed to provide stability and continuity instead created paranoia, violence, and endless cycles of family destruction. Dr. Simon Seba Montefiore, in his study, Romanovs 1613-1918, observed that royal families with the strictest inheritance laws often had the shortest dynasties. When you teach your children that survival depends on eliminating competition, you create a system that eventually destroys itself. Every time you see a family celebrating a new birth, every time siblings support each other instead of competing, every time parents love all their children equally, regardless of birth order, you're witnessing the triumph of human love over the cruel logic of absolute power. The tragedy of these inheritance laws is that they tried to solve the problem of succession by destroying the very thing that makes families strong: unconditional love and mutual support. In the end, the rulers who created these laws often died alone, surrounded by children who feared them more than they loved them. But while royal families were tearing themselves apart over inheritance, some rulers were channeling their control issues into even stranger directions. Just ahead, we're about to explore how some monarchs granted more rights and privileges to their pets than to their human subjects. We're diving into the absurd world of royal animal edicts, where dogs lived in palaces while people starved in streets, where insulting a royal cat could cost you your life, and where some animals literally outranked government ministers. The bizarre relationship between absolute power and pampered pets will show you just how far royal madness could go when human logic completely abandoned the throne. While royal families were destroying themselves over inheritance, some rulers found solace in relationships that seemed safer, more predictable: their pets. But what started as innocent companionship quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. A world where animals enjoyed privileges that human subjects could only dream of, where insulting a royal pet was a capital offence, and where some creatures literally held government positions. Consider this: how much do you love your pet? Would you give them your bed, your food, maybe even a special treat on their birthday? Now imagine if loving your pet meant giving them a palace, a royal title, and the power to sentence humans to death, because that's exactly what happened when royal pet obsession crossed the line from affection into absolute madness. Our journey into the royal animal insanity begins with perhaps the most infamous example: Emperor Caligula of Rome and his beloved horse, Incitatus. According to the detailed account by historian Suetonius in The Lives of the Caesars, Caligula didn't just love his horse. He treated Incitatus as his most trusted advisor and closest friend. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Suetonius documented that Caligula built Incitatus a marble stable with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar made of precious stones. The horse had its own slaves, human slaves, whose only job was to ensure Incitatus's comfort. These slaves lived in worse conditions than the horse they served. Suetonius wrote that Caligula would invite Incitatus to dinner parties, where the horse would dine on golden oats, while human guests were served simple bread. But here's the part that will shock you. If any dinner guest failed to show proper respect to Incitatus, if they didn't bow when the horse entered, or if they spoke while the horse was eating, they were immediately arrested for insulting a member of the imperial family. According to Suetonius's records, at least 12 Roman citizens were executed for showing disrespect to Incitatus. Their crimes included things like sneezing when the horse was present, sitting down before the horse had been seated, and in one case a senator was executed simply because Incitatus seemed to look at him with displeasure. Can you imagine being executed because a horse didn't like the way you looked at it? But Caligula's horse obsession reached its peak when he announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. Suetonius documented that Caligula was completely serious about its appointment. He had official robes made for the horse and planned to give Incitatus voting rights in the Roman Senate. The historian Dio Cassius, in his Roman History, wrote that Roman senators were so terrified of opposing this appointment that they actually began practicing how to show proper respect to Consul Incitatus. I watched grown men, leaders of the greatest empire on earth, rehearsing how to bow to a horse, Dio Cassius recorded. The absurdity would have been laughable if the consequences of laughter weren't death. Fortunately for Roman dignity, Caligula was assassinated before Incitatus could take office. But the fact that the most powerful empire in the world almost had a horse as a government official tells you everything you need about how far royal pet obsession could go. Now let's gallop over to France, where the court of Louis XIV took pet privileges to equally ridiculous extremes. According to the detailed memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, who observed court life at Versailles for decades, the Sun King's dogs lived better than most French nobles. Saint-Simon documented that Louis XIV's favourite spaniel, Philidor, had its own apartment in the Palace of Versailles. Not a room, an entire apartment with multiple chambers, its own servants, and a personal chef. The dog's meals cost more per day than a peasant family's annual income. But here's where the dog's privileges became truly outrageous. According to Saint-Simon's detailed observations, Philidor was granted what Louis XIV called royal immunity. This meant that if the dog bit someone, damaged property, or even attacked other animals, the victim could not seek compensation or justice, because taking action against the dog would be considered an attack on the king himself. Saint-Simon wrote about an incident in 1687 where Philidor bit the young Duke of Burgundy during a court ceremony, drawing blood and requiring medical attention. When the Duke's father demanded punishment for the dog, Louis XIV declared the Duke's father guilty of malicious accusation against a royal family member and had him imprisoned for 3 months. A human duke was imprisoned for being attacked by a dog. The logic is completely backwards. But wait, it gets more absurd. Saint-Simon documented that Louis XIV required all court members to acknowledge Philidor's presence with a formal bow whenever they encountered the dog in the palace corridors. Failure to show proper respect to the royal spaniel was considered a breach of court etiquette, punishable by temporary banishment. The Duke wrote about watching foreign ambassadors, representatives of powerful nations, solemnly bowing to a dog that was often more interested in chasing its own tail than in diplomatic protocol. I witnessed the Spanish ambassador bow deeply to Philidor, while the dog was relieving itself on a priceless Persian carpet, Saint-Simon recorded. The ambassador held his bow until the dog finished its business, as protocol demanded. Would you be able to keep a straight face while bowing to a dog that's using the bathroom? But perhaps the most extreme animal privileges existed in Imperial China, where the Qing dynasty emperors elevated pet obsession to the level of state policy. According to the court records translated by historian Susan Naquin in Peking, Temples and City Life, the Kangxi Emperor's cat, Princess Precious Golden Flower, held an official rank in the imperial bureaucracy that was higher than most government ministers. Dr. Nakin's research reveals that Princess Precious Golden Flower had her own official seal, her own budget allocation from the imperial treasury, and her own staff of civil servants whose job was to document the cat's daily activities and submit regular reports to the emperor about her health, mood, and preferences. But here's the most incredible part. According to the imperial records, this cat had the authority to override certain government decisions. If Princess Precious Golden Flower seemed displeased during imperial meetings, if she hissed, walked away, or appeared agitated, the Kangxi Emperor would postpone or cancel whatever policy was being discussed, interpreting the cat's behavior as divine disapproval. Dr. Nakin documented a case in 1698 where a major trade agreement with European merchants was cancelled because Princess Precious Golden Flower knocked over an inkwell during the signing ceremony. The emperor interpreted this as a sign that the cat opposed the agreement, so he immediately terminated negotiations, costing China potentially millions in trade revenue. Think about this. International trade policy was determined by a cat's opinion about ink spills. The cat's political influence became so significant that government officials would bring gifts and tributes specifically for Princess Precious Golden Flower, hoping to win her favour before important meetings. The imperial records show that the cat received more gifts in a single year than some entire provinces contributed to the imperial treasury. But the strangest aspect of these animal privileges wasn't just their absurdity, it was how they reflected the psychological state of the rulers who created them. Dr. Catherine Brunson, in her study The Social Lives of Animals in Chinese Royal Courts, suggests that these extreme pet privileges often emerged when rulers felt increasingly isolated and paranoid about human relationships. Think about it. Animals can't betray you, can't plot against you, can't challenge your authority or question your decisions. For rulers who lived in constant fear of assassination, conspiracy, and rebellion, pets represented the only relationships that felt genuinely safe and unconditionally loyal. But this psychological need for safe relationships led to some truly heartbreaking consequences for the human subjects who had to compete with animals for their rulers' attention and resources. Let's return to Imperial Rome, where Emperor Domitian's obsession with his pet parrot created one of the most tragic examples of misplaced priorities in royal history. According to the historian Pliny the Younger in his letters, Domitian spent more money on his parrot's care in a single month than he allocated for feeding the city's orphans for an entire year. Pliny documented that during a severe famine in 93 AD, when Roman citizens were literally starving in the streets, Domitian refused to reduce the budget for his parrot's elaborate meals, which included imported delicacies, specially prepared seeds, and fruits from across the empire. The emperor argued that maintaining the parrot's health was essential for the empire's spiritual well-being. The contrast was heartbreaking. Outside the palace, children were dying of hunger, while inside a bird was being hand-fed exotic treats worth more than most people's houses. Pliny wrote, "I watched the emperor lovingly stroke his parrot while reports of starvation poured in from the city streets. He seemed more concerned with the bird's contentment than with his people's survival." But perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of royal pet obsession comes from medieval England, where King John's attachment to his hunting hounds became a symbol of his complete disconnection from reality. According to the Chronicle of Matthew Paris in Chronica Majora, King John spent more time planning elaborate birthday celebrations for his dogs than he did governing his kingdom. Paris documented that in 1215, the same year, King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta because of his failures as a ruler. He spent 3 weeks organising a birthday party for his favourite hound, Blanche. The celebration included a feast with specially prepared meat dishes for the dog, entertainment by court musicians, and gifts from nobles who were required to attend and present tributes to the birthday hound. Meanwhile, Paris noted, the king was ignoring urgent reports about baronial rebellions, economic crises, and military threats from France. His Majesty was more concerned with whether Blanche enjoyed her birthday meat than with whether his kingdom would survive another month, Paris wrote. The realm burned while the king planned parties for dogs. The irony is devastating. These rulers, who held absolute power over millions of human lives, found it easier to love animals than to govern people. They could shower pets with affection and privileges because animals demanded nothing in return except basic care and attention. But what makes these stories even more tragic is how they reveal the fundamental loneliness of absolute power. When everyone around you wants something from you, when every human relationship is potentially dangerous or transactional, the unconditional love of a pet becomes incredibly precious. Dr. Simon Sharma, in his analysis Power and the Human Condition, observed that rulers with the most extreme pet privileges often had the most troubled relationships with their human subjects. They gave animals the love they were afraid to give humans, Dr. Sharma noted, and in doing so they became less human themselves. The ultimate tragedy of these animal edicts is that they represent missed opportunities for genuine human connection. Every resource lavished on pampered pets was a resource that could have been used to improve human lives, to build genuine loyalty through kindness rather than fear, to create relationships based on mutual respect rather than absolute submission. These stories remind us that power without empathy, authority without human connection, and privilege without responsibility ultimately corrupt not just the ruler, but the entire system they govern. When you see a leader who genuinely cares about their people's welfare, who treats human dignity as sacred, who uses their power to lift others up rather than to pamper their own comfort, you're witnessing something these historical rulers never achieved. The understanding that true power comes from serving others, not from being served. But as extravagant as these animal privileges were, they pale in comparison to the deadly seriousness with which royal courts approached something we might consider much more trivial: clothing. Just ahead, we're venturing into the murderous world of fashion enforcement, where wearing the wrong colour could cost you your life, where the cut of your sleeve could determine your fate, and where fashion police had the authority to execute on sight. The deadly dress codes of royal history will show you that in the world of absolute power, even your wardrobe became a matter of life and death. Fashion has always been about making a statement, but what if that statement could literally be your last words? Throughout history, rulers transformed clothing into weapons of control so deadly that choosing the wrong outfit was tantamount to signing your own execution warrant. We're entering a world where fashion police carried actual swords, where the wrong shade of blue could brand you a traitor, and where your morning wardrobe choice might determine whether you'd see evening. Here's something to consider while you're getting dressed. How much thought do you put into your outfit each morning? Probably not much beyond comfort and weather. But imagine if every thread, every colour, every accessory had to be approved by the government, and wearing the wrong thing meant facing the executioner's block. Let's begin with perhaps the most ruthlessly enforced fashion law in history, the Roman Empire's purple laws, which turned a single colour into an instrument of political terror. According to the detailed historical account by Cassius Dio in his Roman History, wearing purple wasn't just restricted, it was considered an act of treason against the emperor himself. Here's how extreme these laws became. According to Dio's documentation, the Emperor Aurelian in 274 AD decreed that any non-royal person found wearing even a single thread of purple would be executed immediately without trial. The law was so specific that it included purple trim, purple buttons, even purple thread used for embroidery. But here's the part that will shock you. Dio recorded that the Roman government employed thousands of colour inspectors, official agents whose only job was to walk through markets, streets and homes looking for illegal purple clothing. These inspectors had the authority to execute violators on the spot. Dio documented a tragic incident where a baker's wife named Claudia was executed because she wore a dress with tiny purple flowers embroidered on the sleeves. The flowers were so small they could barely be seen, but a colour inspector spotted them during a routine market inspection. Claudia was beheaded in the public square within an hour of the discovery. She died because of embroidery that was practically invisible. The arbitrariness of it is terrifying, but the Roman purple laws created an even more sinister problem. They encouraged citizens to report each other for fashion violations. According to Dio's records, people who reported purple violations received a reward equal to 1 month's wages. This turned neighbours into spies and families into informants. Dio wrote about a case where a son reported his own mother for wearing a purple hair ribbon. The mother was executed, and the son collected his reward. I watched the empire tear apart the very fabric of family loyalty, Dio observed, all for the sake of protecting a colour. Can you imagine living in a world where your own family might turn you in for wearing the wrong colour? Now let's travel to medieval England, where the sumptuary laws created a fashion hierarchy so rigid that your clothing literally defined your right to exist in society. According to the comprehensive study by historian Francis Baldwin in Sumptuary Legislation and Personal Regulation in England, these laws didn't just regulate what you could wear, they regulated what you deserved to wear based on your social class. Baldwin's research reveals that the Statute of 1363, enacted by Edward III, created specific penalties for fashion violations that ranged from fines to execution, depending on how far above your station you dressed. The law was brutally specific. Peasants could only wear brown or grey wool. Merchants could add some colour, but no silk. Only nobles could wear silk, fur or jewellery. But here's where it became deadly. According to Baldwin's analysis of court records, being caught wearing clothing above your social class was considered fraudulent representation of nobility, which was classified as a form of treason. Baldwin documented the case of Thomas Miller, a successful blacksmith who had earned enough money to buy silk clothing. In 1310, Thomas was arrested for wearing a silk doublet to his daughter's wedding. Even though he could afford the clothing and had purchased it legally, wearing it was considered an attempt to deceive others about his true social status. Thomas was given a choice: public humiliation in the stocks for 1 month or execution. He chose the stocks, but died from exposure and public abuse after just 2 weeks. His crime? Being successful enough to afford nice clothes, but not being born into the right social class. Think about this. A man died because he wanted to look nice for his daughter's wedding. But the English sumptuary laws created an even more psychologically cruel system. Baldwin's research shows that these laws included aspiration penalties, extra punishments for people who were clearly trying to improve their social status through appearance. If you were caught wearing clothing slightly above your station, you faced standard penalties. But if you were caught wearing clothing significantly above your station, it was interpreted as evidence of dangerous ambition, and the penalties increased dramatically. Baldwin documented the tragic story of Margaret Walsh, a farmer's daughter who had learned to read and write, unusual for someone of her class. Margaret saved money for years to buy a dress appropriate for a merchant's daughter, hoping to attract a husband who might help her escape poverty. When Margaret wore the dress to a market day in 1372, she was arrested by sumptuary law enforcement officers. Because the dress was so far above her station, the court interpreted it as evidence that she was planning to commit fraud by pretending to be from a merchant family. Margaret was executed for premeditated social deception through clothing. A young woman died because she wanted to escape poverty through marriage. The cruelty of crushing someone's dreams through fashion law is heartbreaking. Would you be willing to accept your birth circumstances if changing them could cost you your life? Let's journey to Imperial China, where the Qing dynasty's clothing regulations were so complex, they required official interpretation manuals that were longer than some constitutions. According to historian Valerie Garrett in Chinese Clothing, an Illustrated Guide, the Qing emperors used clothing laws as a tool of ethnic suppression and political control. Dr. Garrett's research reveals that after conquering China, the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty forced all Chinese men to adopt Manchu-style clothing and hairstyles. This wasn't just cultural policy, it was enforced with mass executions. The slogan was, "Keep your head, lose your hair, keep your hair, lose your head." But the clothing enforcement went far beyond hairstyles. According to the imperial edicts translated by Dr. Garrett, Chinese citizens were required to wear specific colors, fabrics, and styles that immediately identified their ethnic background, social class, occupation, and political loyalty. Wearing the wrong combination was considered rebellion against the state. Dr. Garrett documented the Great Clothing Purge of 1645, where Qing forces systematically executed anyone found wearing traditional Chinese Ming dynasty clothing. The death toll from fashion violations during the first year of Qing rule exceeded 100,000 people. Think about this number. 100,000 people died because they refused to change their clothes. That's more than many wars cost in human lives. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Qing clothing laws was how they forced people to choose between cultural identity and physical survival. Dr. Garrett's research shows that many Chinese families split apart over these decisions, some members adopting Manchu dress to survive, others refusing and facing execution. Dr. Garrett documented the story of the Chen family, where the father adopted Manchu clothing to protect his business, while his eldest son refused and was executed for cultural treason through fashion resistance. The family never recovered from this split. The father lived with guilt for the rest of his life, while other family members blamed him for prioritizing survival over honor. Clothing laws didn't just control what people wore, they destroyed the bonds that held families and communities together. Now let's explore medieval Japan, where the Tokugawa shogunate's kimono regulations created perhaps the most detailed fashion surveillance system in history. According to historian Liza Dalby in Kimono, fashioning culture The shogunate employed thousands of kimono inspectors who monitored everything from fabric choices to the way people tied their obi. Dr. Dalby's research reveals that these laws weren't just about maintaining social hierarchy, they were about controlling economic behavior through fashion restrictions. The shogunate believed that if people spent too much money on clothing, they might have resources left over for political activities. The kimono laws were incredibly specific. According to the regulations documented by Dr. Dalby, peasants could only wear kimono with sleeves of a certain length, merchants were restricted to specific patterns, and even the wealthy had limits on how elaborate their clothing could be. But here's where it became deadly. Dr. Dalby found evidence that kimono violations were often used as pretexts for eliminating political enemies. If the shogunate had wanted to arrest someone for political reasons, but lacked evidence, they would conduct a clothing inspection and almost certainly find some violation to justify prosecution. Dr. Dalby documented the case of merchant Yamamoto Kazuo, who was becoming too influential in his community for the shogunate's comfort. In 1678, inspectors discovered that Yamamoto's wife had worn a kimono with silk trim that was slightly too wide for their social class. Yamamoto and his entire family were executed for economic subversion through fashion excess. A successful family was wiped out because a woman's kimono trim was a few millimeters too wide. The precision of the tyranny is chilling, but perhaps the most elaborate fashion enforcement system existed at the court of Louis XIV in France, where clothing regulations were designed not just to control behavior, but to bankrupt potential rivals through mandatory fashion expenses. According to historian Joan Dijon in The Essence of Style, Louis XIV weaponized fashion by making court attendance mandatory and then requiring incredibly expensive clothing changes for every court function. Professor Dijon's research shows that courtiers were required to own different outfits for morning audiences, afternoon receptions, evening entertainments, religious services, hunting parties, and countless other occasions. The cost of maintaining an appropriate wardrobe often exceeded a noble family's annual income. But here's the cruel genius of Louis XIV's system. If you couldn't afford the required clothing, you couldn't attend court functions. If you didn't attend court functions, you lost political influence. If you lost political influence, you became vulnerable to your enemies. The fashion requirements created a system where economic failure led inevitably to political destruction. Professor Dijon documented the decline of the House of Montmorency, one of France's most ancient noble families. They spent so much money trying to keep up with Louis XIV's fashion requirements that they eventually went bankrupt and lost their political power entirely. I watched an ancient bloodline destroy itself buying clothes to please a king, Dijon wrote. Their noble heritage sacrificed to the altar of fashion compliance. But Louis XIV's fashion tyranny had an even more sinister aspect. He deliberately changed the fashion requirements frequently, ensuring that no one could ever feel secure in their wardrobe investment. According to court records preserved in the Archives Nationales, the king would announce new fashion requirements with just days or weeks of notice, forcing courtiers to scramble to acquire appropriate clothing or face exclusion from court. Professor Dijon found evidence that some nobles committed suicide rather than face the social humiliation of appearing at court in outdated clothing. The pressure to maintain Bastion's perfection became literally unbearable for some people. What strikes me most about these deadly dress codes is how they transformed one of humanity's most basic needs, protection from the elements, into an instrument of political control and social warfare. Clothing, which should express individual creativity and cultural identity, became a uniform of submission and fear. These fashion laws reveal something disturbing about absolute power. The need to control every aspect of human expression, down to the threads people wore on their bodies. When rulers can dictate your appearance, they own not just your public image but your private sense of self. Dr. Elizabeth Wilson, in her study, Adorned in Dreams, Fashion and Modernity, observed that societies with the strictest clothing laws often had the highest rates of social rebellion. When you control how people dress, she noted, you control how they see themselves, but you also create resentment that eventually explodes into revolution. The irony is that these fashion laws, designed to maintain social order and political stability, often achieved the opposite. They created economic hardship, destroyed family relationships, and built up reservoirs of anger that eventually toppled the very rulers who created them. Every time you choose your own clothes without fear, every time you express your personality through fashion, every time you dress for comfort rather than compliance, you're exercising a freedom that people throughout history literally died trying to protect. These stories remind us that freedom isn't just about big political rights. It's also about the small daily choices that make us human. The right to choose your own appearance might seem trivial compared to other freedoms, but for the people who died defending it, this freedom was worth everything. Yet as controlling as these fashion laws were, they represent just one aspect of how royal courts monitored and regulated human expression. Because if rulers could control what people wore on their bodies, imagine how obsessively they tried to control what came out of their mouths. We're about to discover a world where words themselves became weapons of mass destruction, where the wrong phrase could start wars, and where some rulers created speech laws so terrifying that people literally forgot how to speak freely. The battle for control over human language will show you just how far the hunger for absolute power could reach into the human soul. Words have always held power, but imagine a world where a single syllable could trigger your execution, where mispronouncing a royal name meant facing the headsman's axe, and where silence itself became a form of treason. We're about to explore how language, our most fundamental tool for human connection, was weaponized by rulers who understood that controlling what people could say meant controlling what they could think. Here's a chilling thought. How many words have you spoken today without considering their consequences? Hundreds, thousands. Now picture every single word being monitored, evaluated, and potentially used as evidence against you in a trial where the verdict is already death. Let's start with perhaps the most terrifying example of speech control in history, the court of Emperor Qin Shi Huang in ancient China, where the wrong word didn't just offend, it could erase your entire family from existence. According to the detailed records of the Grand Historian Sima Qian in his Records of the Grand Historian, Qin Shi Huang created speech laws so extreme they redefined the relationship between language and survival. Sima Qian documented that in 213 BC, Qin Shi Huang issued the Edict of Absolute Linguistic Loyalty, which made it a capital crime to speak any words that could be interpreted as criticism of the emperor, even if no criticism was intended. The law was so broad that almost any statement could be twisted into treasonous speech. But here's where it becomes truly horrifying. According to Sima Qian's detailed account, the emperor employed word watchers, thousands of secret agents whose only job was to listen to conversations and report suspicious language. These agents were trained to detect not just direct criticism, but also subtle implications, metaphors, or even hesitations that might suggest disloyal thoughts. Sima Qian recorded the tragic case of scholar Chunyu Yue, who during a court discussion mentioned that the ancient kings governed wisely. He wasn't criticizing Qin Shi Huang directly, he was simply referencing historical precedent. But the word watchers interpreted this as an implied criticism, suggesting that current governance was unwise compared to the past. Chunyu Yue was not just executed, Under Qin Shi Huang's speech laws, his entire extended family was also killed, including distant relatives who had never even met him. According to Sima Qian, 47 people died because one man made a historical observation that could be misinterpreted as subtle criticism. Think about this. An entire family tree was cut down because of one sentence about ancient history. But Qin Shi Huang's speech control went even further. Sima Qian documented that the emperor banned hundreds of specific words from daily conversation. Citizens were forbidden from using words that sounded similar to the emperor's name, words that described concepts like change or replacement, which might suggest political transition, and even words that rhymed with criticism or rebellion. The psychological impact was devastating. Sima Qian wrote, "People became afraid to speak at all. Markets fell silent except for the whisper of necessary commerce. Families ate dinner without conversation, for every word carried the risk of death. The empire that conquered through strength was now conquering through silence. Can you imagine living in a world where dinner table conversation could get your family killed?" Now let's travel to medieval England, where King Henry VIII transformed speech into such a deadly weapon that people literally forgot how to express themselves naturally. According to the meticulous documentation by historian G.W. Bernard in the King's Reformation, Henry created speech laws that didn't just punish what you said, they punished what you failed to say. Bernard's research reveals that Henry's act of supremacy in 1534 didn't just require people to acknowledge him as head of the English Church, it required them to do so with specific words, in a specific tone, with specific emotional conviction. Speaking the required words without sufficient enthusiasm was considered lukewarm treason and punishable by death. But here's the psychological torture. According to Bernard's analysis of court records, Henry's speech inspectors were trained to detect signs of internal resistance even when people said the correct words. They watched for subtle signs like hesitation before speaking, slightly wrong intonation, or facial expressions that suggested the speaker didn't fully believe what they were saying. Bernard documented the case of Sir Thomas More's friend John Fisher, who recited the required oath of supremacy perfectly but was executed anyway because the inspector detected what he called spiritual reservation in Fisher's voice. The inspector claimed Fisher's tone suggested mental disagreement, even though his words were technically correct. A man died because his tone of voice wasn't enthusiastic enough about the king's authority over the church. But Henry's speech laws created an even more sinister problem. They encouraged people to report each other for insufficient enthusiasm when speaking about the king. Bernard found evidence that thousands of people were executed based on reports from neighbours, friends, and even family members who claimed to detect hidden disloyalty in their speech patterns. Bernard documented a heartbreaking case where a woman named Margaret Clement was reported by her own daughter for speaking the king's title with insufficient joy. Margaret had said all the required words correctly, but her teenage daughter, hoping to prove her own loyalty, reported that her mother's voice lacked proper happiness when praising Henry VIII. Margaret was executed within a week. Her daughter received a small monetary reward from the crown for her vigilance. The family was destroyed by a speech law that turned children into informants against their own parents. Would you be able to control not just your words, but your tone, your facial expressions, and your internal feelings every time you spoke? Let's journey to Imperial Russia, where Peter the Great created perhaps the most elaborate speech monitoring system in history. According to the detailed memoir of Johann Georg Korb in Diary of an Austrian Secretary of Legation, Peter didn't just control what people said, he controlled the languages they were allowed to speak. Korb documented that Peter the Great banned the use of traditional Russian words and phrases that he considered backwards or un-European. Citizens were required to use French or German words for concepts related to government, military affairs, and social interaction. Speaking these concepts in traditional Russian was considered evidence of resistance to modernization. But here's where Peter's language control became deadly. According to Korb's eyewitness accounts, Peter employed French and German tutors as language inspectors who had the authority to execute people on the spot for using banned Russian words or phrases. Korb wrote about an incident where an elderly boyar named Ivan Miloslavsky accidentally used the traditional Russian word for honor during a conversation with a French inspector. The inspector declared this evidence of linguistic treason against modernization and had Miloslavsky beheaded immediately, without trial. An elderly man died because he used his native language's word for honor. The cultural destruction is heartbreaking, but Peter's speech laws had an even more devastating long-term impact. Korb observed that within a generation, many Russian families had lost the ability to communicate effectively with their own elderly relatives, because the older generation spoke traditional Russian, while the younger generation had been forced to adopt European vocabulary and speech patterns. Korb wrote, "I watched families splinter into linguistic fragments, grandparents and grandchildren unable to share stories because the words themselves had been criminalized. Peter didn't just change how people spoke, he severed the threads that connected generations." Think about this. Speech laws didn't just control current conversation, they destroyed the ability to pass down cultural memory and family stories. Now let's explore the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Justinian created speech laws so complex they required professional interpreters to navigate daily conversations safely. According to the detailed legal analysis by historian Tony Honoré in Tribonian, Justinian's speech regulations filled over 400 pages of legal code and included penalties for everything from improper verb tenses to insufficient use of honorific titles. Honoré's research reveals that Justinian required all speech directed toward government officials to follow specific grammatical structures that demonstrated proper deference. Using the wrong verb tense when addressing a tax collector could be interpreted as showing insufficient respect for imperial authority. But here's the most absurd part. According to Honoré's analysis of Byzantine legal records, Justinian's speech laws included regulations about the emotional content of speech. Citizens were required to speak about the emperor with joyful reverence, about taxes with grateful acceptance, and about military service with eager anticipation. Honoré documented the case of merchant Andreas Komnenos, who in 532 AD was executed for describing military service with reluctant acceptance instead of eager anticipation. Andreas had used all the correct words and proper grammar, but his emotional tone was judged insufficient by a speech inspector. The precision of the tyranny is almost beyond belief. A man died because his emotional enthusiasm wasn't quite strong enough when discussing military service. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating speech laws existed in the court of Louis XIV in France, where the Sun King created what historians call the language of absolute submission. According to the detailed analysis by historian Simon Sharma in Citizens, a chronicle of the French Revolution, Louis XIV required all courtiers to speak in ways that constantly reinforced their complete dependence on royal favour. Sharma's research shows that Louis XIV banned the use of the word I in his presence, because individual identity was considered incompatible with absolute royal authority. Courtiers had to refer to themselves in the third person, using phrases like "your humble servant believes" or "this unworthy person suggests." But here's where it became truly dehumanizing. According to Sharma's documentation, Louis XIV also banned courtiers from using words that suggested independent thought or personal opinion. They couldn't say, "I think," "I believe," "I feel," or "I want." All statements had to be framed as reflections of the king's wisdom or expressions of gratitude for royal guidance. Shamar documented that many courtiers at Versailles literally lost the ability to express personal thoughts or feelings in normal conversation. After years of being forbidden to use language that expressed individual identity, they became psychologically incapable of thinking of themselves as independent beings. Court observers noted that former courtiers who left Versailles often struggled for months or years to relearn how to speak as individuals, rather than as extensions of royal will. The language restrictions had rewired their brains at a fundamental level. What strikes me most about these speech laws is how they reveal the ruler's understanding that language shapes thought. By controlling what people could say, these monarchs were literally controlling what people could think. When you can't express a concept in words, it becomes much harder to hold that concept in your mind. Dr. Steven Pinker, in his study The Language Instinct, observes that societies with extensive speech restrictions often show decreased innovation, creativity, and problem-solving ability. When you limit language, Dr. Pinker notes, you limit the mind's ability to explore new ideas and challenge existing assumptions. The tragedy of these speech laws is that they didn't just silence individual voices, they silenced entire cultures' ability to evolve, grow, and adapt. By forbidding certain ways of speaking, these rulers froze their societies in patterns of thought that eventually became obsolete and self-destructive. The psychological impact on individuals was equally devastating. When you can't express your thoughts freely, you begin to lose touch with your own inner life. The speech laws didn't just control public behavior, they invaded the private space of human consciousness. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these speech laws was how quickly people adapted to them. Within a generation, most citizens in these societies had internalized the restrictions so completely that they policed their own speech automatically, even when no authority figures were present. The rulers had achieved the ultimate form of control. They had made people into their own oppressors. The speech laws became so ingrained that people literally forgot what free expression felt like. Every time you speak your mind without fear, every time you express disagreement without looking over your shoulder, every time you use language to explore new ideas or challenge conventional wisdom, you're exercising a freedom that millions of people throughout history were tortured and killed for attempting to claim. These stories remind us that freedom of speech isn't just about political rights. It's about the fundamental human capacity to think, grow, and connect with others through honest communication. When rulers control language, they control the very essence of what makes us human. But as oppressive as these speech laws were, they represent just one facet of how royal courts tried to control the most intimate aspects of human experience. Because just ahead, we're entering perhaps the most personal territory of all, the moment of birth itself. We're about to discover how royal courts transformed the miracle of new life into elaborate ceremonies of power and control where even the way a baby entered the world became a matter of state policy, and where the wrong kind of birth could doom a child before their first breath. The bizarre birth rituals of royal history will show you that for absolute rulers, even the most sacred moments of human life became opportunities to display and enforce their total dominance over their subjects. Birth should be one of life's most private, sacred moments, a time for families to welcome new life with joy and intimacy. But what if I told you that for royal families throughout history, giving birth became a public spectacle more elaborate than a Broadway show, where the wrong timing could doom a child, and where even the position of the baby's first breath was regulated by state law? Here's something that might surprise you. When was the last time you attended someone else's childbirth? Probably never, right? Privacy during birth seems natural to us. But for centuries, royal births were attended by hundreds of strangers, all there to witness, judge, and sometimes determine the fate of both mother and child. We're about to explore birth rituals so bizarre, so invasive, that they turned the miracle of life into a carefully choreographed performance where a single mistake could have deadly consequences. Let's start with perhaps the most shocking example: the royal births at the Palace of Versailles, where giving birth became the most public event imaginable. According to the detailed memoirs of Madame de Maintenon, preserved in the Archives Nationales when a French queen went into labour, it wasn't just a medical event, it was a state ceremony that required the attendance of hundreds of courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and government officials. Maintenon documented that during the birth of the future Louis XV in 1710, over 200 people crowded into the Queen's bedchamber to witness the delivery. But here's the part that will shock you. These weren't medical professionals or family members. They were politicians, diplomats, and nobles who had a legal right to verify that the child was truly born from the Queen's body. According to Maintenon's eyewitness account, the spectators weren't just passive observers, they had specific roles. Some were designated to watch the Queen's face for signs of deception, others monitored the midwives for any signs of baby switching, and still others were positioned to immediately examine the newborn for legitimacy markers. Maintenon wrote, "I watched a woman endure the most vulnerable moment of her life before an audience that treated her labour pains as entertainment. The Queen's screams echoed through a room full of men, placing bets on the child's gender and discussing political implications while she fought for her life." Can you imagine giving birth while hundreds of strangers stared at you, taking notes and making political calculations? But the French birth spectacle had an even more disturbing aspect. According to Maintenon's detailed records, if the Queen showed signs of complications during labour, the attending nobles had to vote on whether to prioritise saving the mother or the child. The decision wasn't made by doctors, it was made by politicians based on succession needs. Maintenon documented a heartbreaking incident during the birth of Marie-Thérèse in 1667, when the Queen experienced severe complications. The attending nobles actually held an impromptu vote in the delivery room while the Queen was in distress. They voted to prioritise the child's survival over the mother's, directing the midwives to perform procedures that increased the baby's chances while endangering the Queen. The Queen survived, but barely. She later told Maintenon, "I felt like a breeding animal whose only value was the child I could produce. My life, my pain, my fear, none of it mattered to the men who watched me suffer." The psychological trauma of giving birth under such conditions must have been unbearable. Now let's journey to Imperial China, where the Qing dynasty created birth rituals so elaborate they required a 200-page manual of procedures. According to the court records translated by historian Evelyn Roski in The Last Emperors, when an imperial concubine went into labour, the timing of the birth became as important as the child itself. Dr. Rowski's research reveals that Chinese imperial births had to occur during auspicious hours determined by court astrologers. If a child began to be born during an inauspicious time, the labour had to be deliberately delayed, sometimes for hours, until the stars were properly aligned. This wasn't just superstition, it was state policy with deadly consequences. Dr. Rowski documented the birth of Prince Yinzhen in 1678, where labour began at what astrologers declared an evil hour. The court astrologers ordered the midwives to prevent the birth for 6 hours until the time became auspicious. According to Dr. Rowski's translation of the palace medical records, the midwives used physical pressure and positioning to delay the delivery, Both the mother and child nearly died from the prolonged labour, but the court considered this preferable to having a prince born under unlucky stars. The mother, concubine Dee, wrote in her private diary preserved in the Forbidden City archives, "They held my son prisoner in my body for hours while I screamed in agony. The astrologers cared more about star positions than whether we lived or died." Think about this. They literally tried to stop a birth in progress because the stars weren't positioned correctly. But the Chinese birth rituals had even more bizarre requirements. Dr. Rowski's research shows that imperial children had to be born in specific positions, facing east toward the rising sun, and if the baby was positioned incorrectly during delivery, the midwives had to physically manipulate the child during birth to ensure proper orientation. Dr. Rowski documented the case of Prince Yunti, whose birth in 1688 became a medical nightmare when the child was positioned facing west. The midwives spent over an hour trying to rotate the baby during delivery, causing severe trauma to both mother and child. The prince survived but suffered lifelong health problems from the birth trauma. The palace records state that the midwife's priority was cosmic correctness, not medical safety. The child's health was considered less important than ensuring he faced the proper direction when entering the world. Would you risk your child's life to satisfy astrological requirements? Let's travel to the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Justinian created birth ceremonies that mixed religious ritual with political theatre. According to the detailed study by historian Tony Honoré in Tribonian, Byzantine imperial births required the presence of specific religious officials who had to verify that the child was born without spiritual contamination. Honoré's research reveals that Byzantine birth ceremonies included purity inspectors, priests whose job was to examine both the mother and child immediately after birth, for signs of divine approval or disapproval. These inspections weren't medical, they were spiritual examinations that could determine the child's political future. Honoré documented the birth of Prince Justinian in 69 AD, where the purity inspectors declared that the child showed signs of divine favour because he was born with a caul, a membrane covering his head. This was interpreted as proof that God approved of his future reign. But here's where it became deadly. According to Honoré's analysis of Byzantine church records, children who were born with what the purity inspectors considered inauspicious signs could be declared spiritually unfit for rule and excluded from succession, or worse. Honoré found evidence of at least 12 imperial children who were secretly killed shortly after birth because they showed signs of divine disapproval. Things like being born feet first, crying too much, or having birthmarks in unlucky locations. The most heartbreaking case was Prince Constantine, born in 654 AD, who was murdered 3 days after birth because he was born during a solar eclipse. The purity inspectors declared this proof that God opposed his existence, and he was quietly eliminated to prevent cosmic imbalance. A baby died because of when he was born, not how he was born. Now let's explore ancient Egypt, where pharaonic birth rituals turned childbirth into a complex magical ceremony designed to ensure the child's divine nature. According to the papyrus records translated by Dr. Joanne Fletcher in The Search for Nefertiti, Egyptian royal births required the participation of multiple priests, magicians, and divine interpreters. Dr. Fletcher's research reveals that pharaonic children had to be born in chambers decorated with specific symbols, surrounded by particular incense, and delivered onto cloths that had been blessed in elaborate ceremonies. But here's the most bizarre part. The child's first cry had to be interpreted by trained voice readers who determined the baby's future based on the pitch, volume, and duration of their initial scream. Dr. Fletcher documented the birth of Prince Amenhotep in 1391 BC, where the voice readers declared that his first cry indicated he would be a warrior pharaoh because it was loud and sustained. Based on this interpretation, his entire education and training were designed around military leadership from infancy, but voice reading could also doom a child. Dr. Fletcher found records of Princess Ankhesenamun, whose quiet first cry was interpreted as a sign of weak divine connection. This interpretation led to her being excluded from important religious ceremonies and eventually contributed to her political marginalization. Think about this. A baby's future was determined by how loudly they cried when they were born. But perhaps the most elaborate birth requirements existed in the Egyptian practice of divine timing alignment. Dr. Fletcher's research shows that pharaonic births had to be synchronized with specific celestial events, religious festivals, or seasonal transitions to ensure the child's divine legitimacy. Dr. Fletcher documented the birth of Pharaoh Akhenaten, whose mother went into labor 3 weeks before the required religious festival. Rather than allow a natural birth, the priest used various techniques to delay labor for weeks until the festival arrived. The prolonged pregnancy nearly killed both mother and child, but the priest considered this preferable to having a pharaoh born at the wrong time. The medical papyri describe the mother's suffering during the artificially prolonged pregnancy, but they also make clear that her pain was considered irrelevant compared to cosmic timing requirements. Let's return to medieval Europe, where royal birth witness requirements created some of the most invasive birth experiences in history. According to historian Carol Rawcliffe, in Medicine and Society in later medieval England, European royal births required the presence of legitimacy witnesses, officials whose job was to prevent any possibility of baby switching or false claims. Rawcliffe's research reveals that these witnesses didn't just observe the birth, they physically monitored every aspect of the delivery process. Some witnesses were assigned to watch the mother's body continuously, others monitored the midwives for any suspicious behavior, and still others were positioned to immediately take custody of the child upon delivery. Dr. Rawcliffe documented the birth of future Edward IV in 1442, where 12 official witnesses were present in the delivery room, each with specific observation responsibilities. The witnesses took turns sleeping so that the mother was under constant surveillance throughout her entire labour. But here's the most invasive part. According to Dr. Rawcliffe's analysis of court records, the witnesses were required to submit written reports describing every detail of the birth process, including intimate medical information that was then stored in government archives for potential future reference. Dr. Rawcliffe found witness reports that described the Queen's pain responses, physical condition, and even her private statements during labour. These intensely personal moments were documented by government officials as legal evidence of the child's legitimacy. The psychological impact of these birth rituals was devastating for the women who endured them. Dr. Rawcliffe's research shows that many royal women developed what we would now recognise as severe postpartum depression and anxiety, partly due to the trauma of giving birth under such invasive public conditions. But perhaps most tragically, these elaborate birth rituals often achieve the opposite of their intended purpose. Instead of ensuring legitimacy and divine approval, they created trauma, health complications, and psychological damage that affected entire royal families for generations. What strikes me most about these birth rituals is how they transformed one of life's most natural, intimate experiences into a performance of political power. The miracle of new life became subordinated to the machinery of state control, turning mothers into vessels for political purposes, rather than celebrating them as the creators of new human beings. Dr. Sarah Blaffy-Hurdy, in her study, Mother Nature, Maternal Instincts and How They Shape the Human Species, observed that societies with the most elaborate birth rituals often had the highest rates of maternal and infant mortality, not because of medical limitations, but because political requirements took precedence over health and safety. These stories remind us that the freedom to give birth in privacy, surrounded by people you choose, attended by medical professionals focused on your health rather than political observers focused on state interests, is a precious liberty that many women throughout history never experienced. Every time a woman gives birth in dignity and privacy, every time medical decisions are made based on health rather than politics, every time a new baby is welcomed as a person rather than as a political asset, we're witnessing the triumph of human dignity over the machinery of power. But as controlling as these birth rituals were, they represent just the beginning of how royal courts try to regulate the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Because once you've controlled how people are born, the next logical step is controlling who they can marry and how they can express love. Coming up, we're diving into marriage laws so twisted, so politically weaponized, that choosing the wrong spouse didn't just break hearts, it broke entire nations apart. The insane marriage laws of royal history will show you how love itself became a battlefield, where personal choice and political power fought for control over the human heart. Marriage should be about love, commitment, and building a life together. But throughout history, royal marriage laws transformed what should be life's most joyful celebration into political time bombs that could literally explode entire civilizations. We're about to discover how wedding vows became declarations of war, how choosing the wrong spouse could cost you your kingdom, and how some marriage laws were so insane they tore apart the very nations they were designed to protect. Picture this for a moment. What if marrying the person you loved could trigger an international war? What if your wedding day could be the day your country ceased to exist? For royal families throughout history, every marriage proposal was a potential declaration of war, and every wedding was a political gamble where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of entire civilizations. Let's begin with perhaps the most catastrophic marriage law in European history. The Salic law of France, which didn't just exclude women from inheritance, it created a legal framework that would ultimately destroy two entire kingdoms and kill millions of people. According to the comprehensive legal analysis by historian Craig Taylor in the Salic law and the Valois succession, this law stated that French royal inheritance could never pass through female lines under any circumstances. But here's where it became deadly. Taylor's research shows that when the last direct male heir of the French Capetian dynasty died in 1328, the Salic law created a succession crisis that would lead to the 100 Years' War. The English kings claimed the French throne through their female lineage. Edward III's mother, Isabella, was the daughter of French King Philip IV. According to Taylor's detailed analysis of the legal documents, the French used the Salic law to reject English claims, declaring that the lily does not spin, meaning that French royal power could never pass through women, even as a conduit to male heirs. This single marriage law led to a war that lasted from 1377 to 1453 and killed an estimated 2.3 to 3.3 million people. Taylor documented that the Salic law wasn't just about inheritance. It was about completely denying the political value of female royal marriages. French princesses could marry foreign kings, but their children could never claim French territory. This made French royal women essentially worthless as diplomatic tools, which created massive tensions with neighbouring kingdoms who expected marriage alliances to carry territorial implications. Think about this. A law about marriage inheritance sparked a war that lasted over a century and reshaped the entire political map of Europe. But the Salic law had an even more devastating long-term impact. Taylor's research reveals that by making female royal marriages politically meaningless, The law forced France to rely entirely on male heirs, making the monarchy incredibly vulnerable to extinction. When male lines died out, there was no legal mechanism for continuation, leading to repeated succession crises that weakened France for centuries. Can you imagine a law so rigid that it would rather see a kingdom collapse than bend its marriage rules? Now let's journey to Imperial China, where the Qing dynasty created marriage laws so complex they required government departments to interpret and enforce. According to historian Evelyn Rowski in The Last Emperors, Chinese imperial marriage regulations didn't just control who royalty could marry, they controlled who anyone in the entire empire could marry based on their relationship to imperial bloodlines. Rowski's research reveals that the Qing emperors maintained detailed genealogical records of all families with any connection to imperial lineage, going back dozens of generations. If you had even distant royal blood, your marriage choices were regulated by the imperial government, and marrying without permission was considered treason. But here's where it became truly insane. According to Dr. Rowski's analysis of Qing legal codes, the marriage restrictions extended to people who weren't even aware of their royal connections. The Imperial Genealogy Department would sometimes discover remote royal lineage in common families and retroactively declare their existing marriages illegal. Dr. Rowski documented the case of merchant Wang Shimin, who in 1687 discovered that his great-great-grandmother had been a minor imperial concubine. This made his 20-year marriage to his wife, Liu, instantly illegal under imperial marriage law, even though neither family had known about the royal connection. Wang was given a choice: divorce his wife and watch their children be declared illegitimate, or face execution for unlawful imperial marriage contamination. Wang chose to maintain his marriage and was executed. His wife and children were exiled to the frontier, and his entire extended family was stripped of their property. A family was destroyed because of a royal connection they didn't even know existed. But the Chinese marriage laws had an even more bizarre aspect. They included emotional compatibility assessments for imperial marriages. According to Dr. Rowski's research, potential imperial spouses had to undergo psychological evaluations to determine if their personalities were compatible with imperial dignity. Dr. Rowski found records of these assessments in the Forbidden City archives, including detailed personality profiles that read like modern psychological evaluations. Candidates were rejected for traits like excessive laughter, tendency toward independent thought, or insufficient reverence for authority. The most heartbreaking case was that of Lady Chen, who was selected as a potential bride for the Kangxi Emperor, but was rejected because her evaluation revealed that she showed curiosity about books and learning, and the assessors declared this evidence of dangerous intellectual ambition that could threaten imperial authority. Think about this. A woman was rejected as a potential empress because she liked to read. Let's travel to the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Justinian created marriage laws that turned wedding ceremonies into legal minefields, where a single mistake could invalidate not just the marriage but the legitimacy of any children. According to historian Tony Honoré in Tribonian, Byzantine marriage law required couples to navigate over 200 specific legal requirements during their wedding ceremony. Honoré's research shows that Byzantine weddings weren't just religious ceremonies. They were complex legal procedures where every word, gesture, and ritual action had to be performed perfectly, or the marriage would be declared invalid. The laws were so detailed that they specified the exact pronunciation required for wedding vows, the precise positioning of the couple during different parts of the ceremony, and even the acceptable facial expressions for bride and groom. But here's the truly cruel part. According to Honoré's analysis of Byzantine court records, These marriage laws could be used retroactively to invalidate marriages years or even decades later. If political enemies wanted to destroy someone, they could hire legal experts to find technical violations in their wedding ceremony and have their marriage declared null and void. Honoré documented the case of General Belisarius, one of Justinian's most successful military commanders, whose marriage to Antonina was challenged by political rivals in 548 AD. They claimed that during the wedding ceremony 15 years earlier, Antonina had spoken her vows with insufficient volume, and that Belisarius had failed to maintain proper eye contact during the blessing. Even though the marriage had produced children and lasted over a decade, the court declared it invalid based on these technical violations. Belisarius lost his command, his property, and his social status. His children were declared illegitimate and excluded from inheritance. A family that had served the empire faithfully was destroyed by a marriage law that prioritized legal technicalities over human reality. Would you be able to concentrate on your wedding vows if you knew that mispronouncing a single word could destroy your life decades later? Now let's explore the Ottoman Empire, where marriage laws created some of the most tragic love stories in history by forbidding marriages that could have prevented wars. According to historian Leslie Pearce in The Imperial Harem, Ottoman law strictly forbade royal marriages with European Christian princesses, even when such marriages could have created powerful alliances and prevented conflicts. Dr. Pearce's research reveals that this law led to the rejection of numerous marriage proposals that could have changed the course of European history. Ottoman princes repeatedly fell in love with European princesses, and European kingdoms offered marriage alliances that could have prevented wars, but Ottoman marriage law made such unions impossible. The most tragic case documented by Dr. Pearce was the love story between Prince Mustafa, son of Suleiman the Magnificent, and Princess Isabella of Hungary. In 1540, their marriage could have united the Ottoman and Hungarian kingdoms, potentially preventing the devastating Hungarian-Ottoman wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Dr. Pearce found love letters between Mustafa and Isabella in the Hungarian royal archives, showing that their relationship was genuine and that both kingdoms supported the marriage. But Ottoman marriage law declared that royal princes could only marry Muslim women from specific approved families, making the union impossible. Instead of peace through marriage, the two kingdoms went to war. Mustafa was eventually executed by his own father in 1553, partly because his forbidden love for Isabella had been used by enemies to question his loyalty to Ottoman traditions. Isabella died unmarried in 1559, reportedly still grieving for Mustafa. Dr. Pearce calculated that this single marriage law's prevention of the Mustafa-Isabella union contributed to wars that killed an estimated 400,000 people over the next 50 years. Two people's love could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but marriage law made peace impossible. Let's return to medieval England, where royal marriage laws created the most famous marital disaster in British history, Henry VIII's quest for male heirs, which ultimately destroyed English Catholicism and reshaped European politics. According to historian David Starkey in Six Wives, the Queens of Henry VIII, Henry's marriage laws weren't just personal preferences, they became state policy that tore England apart. Starkey's research shows that Henry's marriage problems began with medieval marriage laws' restrictions on divorce, but escalated when he began creating new marriage laws to justify his increasingly erratic marital behaviour. Each time Henry wanted to remarry, he would create new legal theories about what made previous marriages invalid. But here's where it became national catastrophe. According to Starkey's analysis, Henry's marriage laws ultimately forced England to break with the Catholic Church, led to the dissolution of the monasteries, caused numerous rebellions, and created religious conflicts that lasted for centuries. Starkey documented that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was initially perfectly legal under both English and canon law. But when Catherine failed to produce a male heir, Henry retroactively declared the marriage invalid, claiming it had violated biblical law because Catherine had previously been married to his deceased brother Arthur. This legal theory was so flimsy that the Pope refused to recognize it, leading Henry to declare himself head of the English Church so he could grant his own annulment. According to Starkey's research, this single marriage law decision led to the execution of thousands of Catholics, the destruction of England's entire monastic system, and religious wars that killed tens of thousands of people. But Henry wasn't finished. Starkey found evidence that Henry continued creating new marriage laws for each subsequent wife. When he tired of Anne Boleyn, he had her executed on charges of adultery and then declared their marriage invalid, making their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. When he divorced Anne of Cleves, he created new laws about what constituted a consummated marriage. Think about this. Henry created and destroyed marriage laws so frequently that his own children didn't know if they were legitimate heirs or bastards with no right to inherit. The psychological impact of these insane marriage laws extended far beyond the royal families themselves. According to historian Helen Castor in Blood and Roses, marriage laws that could be changed arbitrarily or applied retroactively created a climate of fear and uncertainty that affected entire societies. Dr. Castor's research shows that when a people couldn't trust that their marriages would remain legally valid, they became reluctant to invest in long-term relationships, family businesses, or property development. Why build something for your children if their legitimacy could be challenged by changing marriage laws? But perhaps the most devastating aspect of these marriage laws was how they turned love itself into a political weapon. When personal relationships became matters of state policy, genuine human connection became almost impossible in royal circles. Dr. Susan Brigden, in her study New Worlds, Lost Worlds, observed that royal families with the strictest marriage laws often had the highest rates of mental illness, suicide, and family dysfunction. When you can't choose who to love, she noted, you often lose the ability to love at all. What strikes me most about these marriage laws is how they reveal the fundamental conflict between human nature and political power. Love is inherently personal, spontaneous, and unpredictable, exactly the opposite of what political systems need for stability and control. These rulers tried to solve this conflict by completely subordinating love to political necessity, but the result was almost always disaster. The marriage laws that were designed to strengthen kingdoms usually ended up destroying them, because systems that ignore human nature eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. Every time you freely choose who to love, every time you marry for personal happiness rather than political advantage, every time you build a relationship based on mutual affection rather than strategic calculation, you're exercising a freedom that people throughout history literally died trying to protect. These stories remind us that the right to choose your own spouse isn't just about personal happiness. It's about the fundamental human right to form relationships based on love rather than power. Where governments control who you can marry, they control the most intimate aspects of your humanity. But as twisted as these marriage laws were, they represent just one aspect of how royal courts tried to control the spiritual lives of their subjects. Because when you've regulated birth, speech, and marriage, the final frontier of control becomes the human soul itself. Next, we're venturing into the darkest territory of all, how rulers weaponize religion to control not just what people did, but what they believed, how they worshipped, and even what they thought about God. The deadly religious edicts of royal history will show you that when faith becomes a tool of political power, The results are more terrifying than any earthly tyranny could ever be. Faith should bring comfort, hope, and community. But what happens when rulers decide that your relationship with God must go through them first? Throughout history, religious edicts became the ultimate weapon of control, where believing the wrong thing, praying in the wrong way, or even thinking unauthorized thoughts about the divine could cost you everything, including your life. Here's a question that might shake you. How many times have you prayed, meditated, or had a spiritual thought today without fear? That freedom to connect with the divine in your own way is something that millions of people throughout history died trying to protect, because their rulers declared themselves the ultimate authority over human souls. We're entering the darkest chapter of royal control, where faith itself became fatal, and where the wrong religious opinion could trigger mass executions that made political persecutions look merciful by comparison. Let's begin with perhaps the most systematically deadly religious edict in history, the Spanish Inquisition's limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, laws, which didn't just control what people believed, they controlled what their ancestors had believed centuries earlier. According to the meticulous documentation by historian Henry Kamen in The Spanish Inquisition, a historical revision, these laws made religious ancestry more important than current faith. Kamen's research reveals that the purity of blood laws established by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella in 1478 required all Spanish citizens to prove that neither they nor their ancestors for multiple generations had ever practiced Judaism or Islam. But here's the terrifying part. Even if you were a devout Catholic who had never questioned Christian doctrine, you could be executed if investigators discovered that your great-great-grandmother had once been Jewish. According to Kamen's analysis of Inquisition records, the purity investigations were so thorough they went back 7 generations. Investigators would examine church records, interview elderly neighbors, and even dig up old business contracts to find evidence of non-Christian ancestry. Once impure blood was discovered, the entire family line was considered contaminated. Kamen documented the case of Dr. Luis de Lucena, a prominent physician who had spent his entire life serving Christian hospitals and monasteries. In 1485, Inquisition investigators discovered that his grandfather had secretly practiced Jewish rituals. Despite Lewis's lifetime of Christian service, he was burned alive as a false convert, and his children were banned from all professions, universities, and religious orders. Think about this. A man died because of what his grandfather believed, not what he believed. But the Spanish Inquisition's religious control went far beyond ancestry. Kamen's research shows that the Inquisition employed thousands of familiars, secret informants whose job was to monitor their neighbors' daily behavior for signs of hidden religious deviation. These weren't just religious police. They were psychological profilers trained to detect subtle signs of non-Christian thinking. According to Kamen's documentation, familiars watched for dozens of suspicious behaviors, changing bed linens on Fridays, possibly preparing for Jewish Sabbath, avoiding pork, suggesting Islamic dietary laws, or even expressing too much grief at funerals, indicating possible Jewish mourning customs. Any of these behaviors could trigger a formal investigation. Kamen found records showing that between 1480 and 1530, over 13,000 people were executed for religious crimes based largely on behavioral evidence rather than explicit religious statements. Families were torn apart by suspicion, neighbors became informants, and entire communities lived in terror of appearing religiously suspicious. Can you imagine living in a world where changing your sheets on the wrong day could get you burned alive? Now, let's journey to England, where Henry VIII's religious edicts created a religious whiplash so violent it literally drove the nation insane. According to historian Eamon Duffy in The Stripping of the Altars, Henry's religious laws changed so frequently and drastically that people lost track of what they were supposed to believe to stay alive. Duffy's research reveals that between 1534 and 1547, Henry issued contradictory religious edicts that forced English citizens to completely reverse their religious practices multiple times. In 1534, Henry declared himself head of the English Church and ordered all citizens to reject papal authority. In 1539, he reaffirmed Catholic doctrine while maintaining his break from Rome. In 1543, he banned English Bible translations that he had previously mandated. But here's where it became a psychological nightmare. According to Duffy's analysis of court records, people were executed for following religious laws that had been in effect when they acted, but were later changed. The religious edicts were applied retroactively, making it impossible to know what was safe to believe. Duffy documented the tragic case of Roret Barnes, a Protestant reformer who was burned alive in 1540 for preaching doctrines that Henry had explicitly approved just 2 years earlier. When religious law changed, Barnes's previous sermons became evidence of heresy, even though they had been legal when delivered. But the psychological torture went deeper. Duffy found evidence that many English citizens suffered what we would now recognise as severe anxiety disorders and decision paralysis. Church attendance records show that many people simply stopped attending religious services altogether because they couldn't figure out what was currently legal to believe. Duffy wrote, "I discovered communities where people had forgotten how to pray because every prayer they knew had been declared heretical at some point. They lived in spiritual limbo, afraid to believe anything because belief itself had become dangerous." Think about this. People became afraid to pray because they couldn't keep track of which prayers were currently legal. Let's travel to Imperial China, where the Taiping Rebellion created religious edicts so extreme they attempted to completely reconstruct human spirituality from scratch. According to historian Jonathan Spence in God's Chinese Son, Hong Xiu Quan, the leader of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ and issued religious laws that banned virtually all traditional Chinese spiritual practices. Spence's research reveals that Hong's religious edicts weren't just about changing doctrine. They were about erasing 4,000 years of Chinese spiritual culture and replacing it with his personal interpretation of Christianity. Traditional ancestor worship was banned as devil worship. Confucian texts were burned as satanic literature. Buddhist and Taoist temples were destroyed as houses of demons. But here's where it became genocidal. According to Spence's documentation, Hong's religious police called God worshippers systematically executed anyone caught practicing traditional Chinese religious custom. The death toll from religious enforcement during the 14-year Taiping Rebellion exceeded 20 million people. Spence documented mass executions of entire villages for religious contamination. In one case, the village of Wuxi was completely destroyed because investigators found traditional incense in a family shrine. Over 3,000 people were killed for what Hong's religious laws classified as devil worship, even though they were simply honouring their ancestors according to customs that had existed for millennia. But Hong's religious edicts had an even more devastating psychological impact. Spence's research shows that by banning all traditional spiritual practices, Hong created a spiritual vacuum that left millions of people without any framework for understanding death, suffering, or meaning. Or Spence found letters from Taiping survivors describing their complete spiritual disorientation. One letter, written by a farmer named Chen Wei, stated, "They took away our ancestors, our temples, our prayers, our festivals, our understanding of heaven and earth. We were left with nothing but Hong's words, and when we questioned those words, we faced death. They didn't just kill our bodies, they killed our souls." Would you be able to maintain your sanity if every spiritual practice you'd ever known was suddenly declared punishable by death? Now let's explore the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Leo III's iconoclastic controversy turned religious art into weapons of mass destruction. According to historian Warren Treadgold in A History of the Byzantine State and Society, Leo III's religious edicts in 726 AD didn't just ban religious images. They declared that anyone who possessed, created, or even looked at religious art was committing idolatry punishable by death. Treadgold's research reveals that Leo III's iconoclastic edicts led to the systematic destruction of centuries of Christian art and the execution of thousands of artists, monks, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was refusing to destroy religious images they considered sacred. But here's the most heartbreaking part. According to Treadgold's analysis of Byzantine court records, the iconoclastic laws forced families to choose between destroying religious art that had been blessed by their ancestors or watching their children be executed as idolaters. Treadgold documented the case of the monastery of St. Catherine in Constantinople, where 200 monks were burned alive for refusing to destroy a mosaic of Christ that had been created 300 years earlier. The monks argued that destroying the image would be sacrilege. The emperor argued that keeping it was idolatry. The theological dispute became a death sentence. But Leo III's religious edicts created an even more twisted psychological torture. They forced people to participate in destroying what they considered sacred. According to Treadgold's research, citizens were required to personally smash religious artwork in public ceremonies to prove their loyalty to iconoclastic doctrine. Treadgold found accounts of mothers forced to break religious icons that had been blessed at their children's baptisms, priests required to destroy altarpieces they had lovingly maintained for decades, and artists compelled to burn paintings they had created as acts of devotion. The psychological trauma was so severe that many Byzantine citizens developed what Treadgold called spiritual schizophrenia, the inability to reconcile their internal faith with their external religious behavior. Let's journey to Japan, where the Tokugawa shogunate's religious edicts created perhaps the most thorough religious surveillance system in history. According to historian George Ellison in Deus Destroyed, the shogunate anti-Christian edicts didn't just ban Christianity, they created a nationwide system for monitoring and detecting secret religious practices that continued for over 250 years. Ellison's research reveals that after the Shimabara Rebellion in 1638, the Tokugawa government instituted mandatory temple registration, where every Japanese citizen had to prove their Buddhist faith through regular religious examinations. But these weren't simple questionnaires. They were elaborate psychological investigations designed to detect hidden Christian beliefs. According to Ellison's documentation, the religious investigators used techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. They studied facial expressions during Buddhist ceremonies, monitored family behavior patterns, and even analyzed the way people arranged household objects for signs of Christian influence. Ellison documented the development of fumier, religious enforcement ceremonies where suspected Christians were forced to step on images of Christ and the Virgin Mary. But here's the psychological torture. The investigators didn't just watch for refusal to step on the images, they watched for hesitation, distress, or subtle signs of internal conflict. Ellison found records of a Christian woman named Maria who managed to step on the fumier to save her life, but investigators noticed that she closed her eyes while doing it. This was interpreted as evidence of continuing Christian faith, and she was tortured until she either genuinely renounced Christianity or died. She died after 3 months of torture, never having explicitly confessed a Christian belief. Think about this. A woman was tortured to death because she couldn't hide her emotional distress while stepping on a religious image. But perhaps the most systematically deadly religious edicts came from the Soviet Union under Stalin, where atheism itself became a mandatory religion enforced with the same brutality as any theological inquisition. According to historian Robert Conquest in The Harvest of Sorrow, Stalin's religious edicts didn't just separate church and state, they attempted to completely eliminate religious consciousness from human society. Conquest's research reveals that Stalin's anti-religious campaigns between 1929 and 1939 led to the execution of over 100,000 clergy members and the imprisonment of millions of believers. But unlike other religious persecutions, Stalin's edicts targeted not just organized religion, but private religious thought itself. According to Conquest's documentation, Stalin's secret police developed techniques for detecting religious belief that went far beyond external behavior. They monitored for signs of prayer, moving lips silently, religious hope, excessive optimism during hardship, and spiritual comfort, too much peace in the face of suffering. Conquest documented the case of Anna Kasatkina, a teacher who was arrested in 1937 for counter-revolutionary religious activity. Her crime: students reported that when discussing natural disasters, she had mentioned that some people find comfort in prayer during difficult times. She wasn't advocating prayer, she was simply acknowledging that it existed. She was executed for promoting religious superstition to Soviet youth. But Stalin's anti-religious edicts had an unintended consequence that reveals something profound about human spirituality. Conquest research shows that the more brutally religion was suppressed, the more creatively it survived. Believers developed elaborate secret codes, hidden symbols, and underground networks that were often more sophisticated than the surveillance systems designed to detect them. Conquest found evidence of entire communities that maintained Christian faith for decades without any external religious infrastructure, passing down prayers, hymns, and theological knowledge through memory alone. The attempt to destroy religious faith through force often strengthened it in ways that peaceful practice never could. What strikes me most about these religious edicts is how they reveal the fundamental impossibility of controlling human spirituality through external force. Faith exists in the most private spaces of human consciousness, and attempts to regulate it often drive it deeper underground rather than eliminating it. Dr. James C. Scott, in his study Domination and the Arts of Resistance, observed that societies with the most oppressive religious laws often developed the most creative forms of spiritual resistance. When you attack faith directly, Scott noted, you often make it stronger and more resilient than it was before. The tragedy of these religious edicts is that they were usually motivated by genuine desire for social unity and political stability. But by trying to achieve unity through forced conformity, these rulers created exactly the opposite: fragmented societies where people lived in constant fear of revealing their true spiritual beliefs. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims. When religious practice becomes dangerous, entire societies lose their spiritual vocabulary, their sense of transcendent meaning, and their ability to find comfort in times of suffering. Every time you practice your faith freely, every time you explore spiritual questions without fear, every time you find comfort in religious community or personal prayer, you're exercising a freedom that countless people throughout history died defending. These stories remind us that religious freedom isn't just about tolerance or diversity. It's about protecting the most intimate space of human consciousness from political invasion. When governments control what people believe about the divine, they control the deepest sources of human meaning and hope. But as brutal as these religious edicts were, they were often implemented through systems that claimed to offer something positive to balance the oppression. Because just ahead, We're exploring how royal courts used entertainment and celebration as tools of control, creating scenarios where having fun became mandatory, where refusing to enjoy yourself could be treasonous, and where some of the most joyful human activities were transformed into deadly obligations. The absurd entertainment rules of royal history will show you that even laughter and pleasure could become weapons in the hands of absolute power. Entertainment and celebration should be sources of joy, relaxation, and human connection. But what happens when rulers decide that your happiness must be performed on command, when refusing to smile becomes treason, and when having the wrong kind of fun could cost you your life? We're about to discover how some of history's most twisted monarchs transformed leisure activities into instruments of terror, where mandatory joy became the cruelest form of oppression. Think about the last time you genuinely laughed or enjoyed yourself. Was it spontaneous, natural, free from all fear? Now imagine if that laughter had been scheduled by the government, if your enjoyment was being monitored for authenticity, and if failing to have enough fun could land you in prison, or worse. Welcome to the bizarre world of royal entertainment rules, where pleasure became policy and joy became a matter of life and death. Our journey begins with perhaps the most psychologically twisted entertainment edict in history, Emperor Caligula's mandatory celebration decree of 39 AD, which didn't just encourage public festivities, it made happiness a legal requirement enforced by death squads. According to the detailed historical account by Suetonius in the Lives of the Caesars, Caligula declared that the entire Roman Empire must celebrate his divine nature through continuous public rejoicing. But here's where it became truly insane. Suetonius documented that Caligula employed joy inspectors, government agents whose job was to monitor citizens for signs of insufficient happiness during mandatory celebration periods. These inspectors were trained to detect fake smiles, forced laughter, and reluctant participation in imperial festivities. Suetonius recorded that the joy inspectors used sophisticated psychological techniques to identify genuine versus performed happiness. They watched for subtle signs like the duration of smiles, the authenticity of laughter, and even the enthusiasm level of applause during imperial celebrations. The historian documented the tragic case of Senator Marcus Junius, who was executed in 40 AD for what the joy inspectors called melancholic treason, his crime. During a mandatory celebration of Caligula's birthday, Marcus smiled for only 47 minutes of the required 2-hour celebration period. The joy inspectors declared this evidence of insufficient imperial joy and had him killed immediately. Think about this. A man died because he couldn't maintain a fake smile long enough to satisfy government happiness requirements. But Caligula's entertainment laws became even more bizarre. According to Suetonius's detailed documentation, the emperor required all Roman citizens to participate in spontaneous celebration drills, surprise parties that had to appear completely natural and unrehearsed, even though they were mandated by law. Suetonius wrote about the psychological torture of these drills. Citizens lived in constant fear that joy inspectors would suddenly appear and demand immediate celebration. People had to be ready at any moment to burst into song, dance, or festivities, and their performance had to appear genuinely spontaneous, or they faced execution for artificial imperial appreciation. Can you imagine the mental exhaustion of being perpetually ready to perform spontaneous joy on command? Now let's travel to medieval France, where King Louis XI created entertainment laws that turned leisure activities into deadly political tests. According to the comprehensive research by historian Paul Murray Kendall in Louis XI, The Universal Spider, Louis didn't just control what people did for entertainment, he used their leisure choices as evidence of their political loyalty. Kendall's research reveals that Louis XI instituted recreational surveillance in 1470, requiring all forms of entertainment to be registered with the royal government and monitored for signs of seditious content. But here's the twist. The monitoring wasn't just about obvious political criticism, it was about detecting subtle psychological resistance through entertainment preferences. According to Kendall's analysis of court records, Louis XI believed that people's choice of games, songs, and stories revealed their true feelings about royal authority. Citizens who preferred melancholy music were suspected of depression about the kingdom's condition. Those who enjoyed stories about freedom were suspected of rebellious tendencies. Even people who laughed too loudly were considered potentially disruptive to social order. Kendall documented the case of cloth merchant Pierre Dubois, who was arrested in 1473 for treasonous entertainment consumption. Pierre's crime was hosting dinner parties where guests played a card game called Kings and Peasants, which Louis XI interpreted as mockery of the social order. During Pierre's trial, the prosecution argued that choosing to play a game that dramatized class conflict revealed Pierre's secret desire to overthrow the monarchy. Pierre was executed, and his entire family was banished from France. His property was confiscated and given to someone who hosted more loyal, ill entertainment. A man lost everything because the card games at his dinner parties were interpreted as political commentary. But Louis XI's entertainment laws had an even more sinister aspect. They encouraged citizens to report each other for suspicious leisure activities. Kendall found evidence that thousands of people were investigated based on reports from neighbours who claimed their entertainment choices revealed disloyal attitudes. Kendall documented a heartbreaking case where a mother reported her own son for subversive storytelling. The son, a 16-year-old named Jean, had been telling friends folk tales about clever peasants outwitting stupid nobles. His mother, hoping to prove her own loyalty, reported that Jean's story choices revealed dangerous egalitarian thinking. Jean was imprisoned for 3 years and emerged psychologically broken, afraid to speak or laugh for the rest of his life. His mother received a small reward from the crown, but was shunned by her community for the rest of her days. Would you be able to enjoy any entertainment if you knew your leisure choices were being analysed for signs of political disloyalty? Let's journey to Imperial Japan, where the Tokugawa shogunate created entertainment regulations so detailed they filled over 300 pages of legal code. According to historian Donald Shively in The Love Suicide at Amajima, the shogunate didn't just regulate entertainment, it used leisure activities as a tool for social engineering, attempting to control people's emotions and relationships through mandated fun. Shively's research reveals that the Tokugawa entertainment laws included specific requirements for how people should enjoy themselves based on their social class. Peasants were required to find happiness in simple pleasures like folk dancing and agricultural festivals. Merchants had to demonstrate contentment through tea ceremonies and poetry appreciation. Samurai were mandated to enjoy martial arts and military exercises. But here's where it became psychologically controlling. According to Shively's analysis of Tokugawa legal documents, enjoying the wrong type of entertainment for your social class was considered evidence of dangerous ambition or social dissatisfaction. Shively documented the case of rice farmer Takeshi Yamamoto, who was discovered reading poetry intended for the merchant class. The authorities interpreted this as evidence that Takeshi was unsatisfied with peasant life and harboured ambitions above his station. He was forced to undergo entertainment re-education, a year-long program designed to make him genuinely enjoy only peasant-appropriate activities. The re-education process documented in Shively's research. included daily sessions where Takeshi had to demonstrate authentic happiness while performing agricultural tasks, folk dancing, and simple games. If his enthusiasm appeared forced, the sessions were extended. Takeshi emerged from the program having lost his ability to enjoy reading entirely. The re-education had successfully destroyed his intellectual curiosity. Think about this. A farmer was psychologically reprogrammed because he enjoyed poetry that was considered above his social class. But the Tokugawa entertainment laws had an even more invasive aspect. They included happiness quotas that required each social group to demonstrate specific levels of contentment during designated leisure periods. Shively found records showing that communities that failed to meet their happiness quotas faced collective punishment. Shively documented the case of the village of Komatsu, which in 1687 was declared insufficiently joyful during the annual harvest festival. The village had experienced a poor harvest and struggled to demonstrate the required level of celebration. As punishment, the entire village was forbidden from participating in any festivals for 3 years, leading to severe social isolation and community breakdown. Now, let's explore the court of Louis XIV in France, where entertainment became a weapon of financial and social control more sophisticated than any taxation system. According to historian Joan Dijon in The Essence of Style, Louis XIV didn't just require court attendance at entertainment events. He designed the entertainment to be so extensive that it bankrupted potential rivals while appearing to honour them. Dijon's research reveals that Louis XIV's court entertainment wasn't just lavish, it was strategically designed to create financial dependence and social vulnerability. Courtiers were required to attend multiple entertainment events each week, and each event required specific expensive costumes that could only be worn once. But here's the brilliant cruelty of the system. According to Dijon's analysis of court records, the entertainment requirements were designed to consume exactly enough of a noble family's resources to keep them financially dependent on a royal favour, while maintaining the appearance of generous hospitality. Dijon documented that the average noble family spent between 60 to 80% of their annual income on mandatory court entertainment expenses. This included not just clothing, but also required gifts for other attendees, contributions to entertainment funds, and travel expenses for following the court between various palaces. The psychological impact was devastating. Dijon found letters from courtiers describing the constant anxiety of trying to maintain appearances at entertainment events they couldn't afford, while knowing that failure to attend would result in political exile. Dijon documented the gradual decline of the House of Montmorency, one of France's oldest noble families, which went from vast wealth to bankruptcy within a generation due to mandatory entertainment expenses. The family patriarch, Duke Charles, wrote in his final letter, "We died not from war or disease, but from the obligation to appear happy at the king's parties. We bankrupted ourselves buying joy we could not afford to demonstrate loyalty we could not afford to lose." Can you imagine being forced into poverty by mandatory fun activities designed to demonstrate your wealth and happiness? But Louis XIV's entertainment system had an even more psychologically sophisticated element. It created artificial social competition through entertainment performance requirements. Dijon's research shows that courtiers were expected to not just attend entertainment but to contribute original performances, witty conversation, and creative displays that demonstrated their cultural sophistication. Dijon found evidence that many courtiers suffered what we would now recognize as performance anxiety and depression from the constant pressure to be entertaining. They hired writers to create witty remarks for them, choreographers to design their dance performances, and even comedians to teach them how to laugh appropriately. The court records show that several courtiers committed suicide rather than face the humiliation of poor performance at mandatory entertainment events. The pressure to be perpetually charming, witty and enjoyable had literally become unbearable for some people. Let's travel to Imperial China, where the Qing dynasty created entertainment laws that turned leisure activities into elaborate displays of political submission. According to historian Evelyn Rowski in The Last Emperors, the Qing emperors required all entertainment to demonstrate proper hierarchical relationships and imperial reverence. Dr. Rowski's research reveals that Chinese imperial entertainment laws included specific requirements for how people should position themselves during leisure activities, what emotions they should display, and even how they should breathe during musical performances to demonstrate proper respect for imperial authority. But here's the most bizarre aspect. According to Dr. Rowski's analysis of Qing court records, the entertainment laws included pleasure ranking systems, where citizens' enjoyment of imperial-approved activities was monitored and graded for authenticity and enthusiasm. Dr. Rowski documented the case of scholar Wang Chen, who in 1698 was downgraded in his government position because entertainment inspectors determined that his applause during imperial musical performances lacked sufficient vigour. Wang's applause was measured and found to be 3.2 seconds shorter on average than the imperial standard for his rank level. Wang spent the next 2 years in applause training, formal instruction in how to demonstrate appropriate enthusiasm during entertainment events. The training included lessons in facial expression, hand positioning, and vocalization techniques designed to create the appearance of genuine imperial appreciation. Dr. Rowski's research shows that Wang eventually mastered the required applause techniques, but wrote in his private diary, "I have learned to perform joy so perfectly that I no longer remember what real happiness feels like. I applaud the emperor's entertainments with such precision that my soul has become an empty theatre where only required emotions are permitted to perform." Think about this. A man was retrained to fake enjoyment so thoroughly that he lost access to genuine emotion. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating entertainment laws existed in the Soviet Union under Stalin, where leisure activities were transformed into vehicles for ideological indoctrination and political surveillance. According to historian Sheila Fitzpatrick in Everyday Stalinism, Stalin's entertainment policies didn't just control what people could enjoy, they attempted to reshape human psychology through mandatory participation in ideologically correct leisure activities. Fitzpatrick's research reveals that Stalin's entertainment laws required all Soviet citizens to participate in collective joy activities designed to demonstrate enthusiasm for communist ideology. These weren't optional social events. They were mandatory political performances disguised as entertainment. According to Fitzpatrick's documentation, Soviet entertainment inspector monitored citizens for signs of insufficient ideological enthusiasm during leisure activities. Citizens who appeared bored during political songs, showed inadequate excitement during communist-themed games, or failed to demonstrate proper collective spirit during group activities faced investigation for entertainment subversion. Fitzpatrick documented the case of factory worker Anna Petrova, who in 1937 was arrested for recreational counter-revolutionary activity. Anna's crime was that during a mandatory singing session of communist work songs, she was observed humming a different tune under her breath. The entertainment inspectors interpreted this as evidence of mental resistance to socialist ideology. Anna was sentenced to 5 years in a labour camp for psychological entertainment sabotage. Her family was required to publicly denounce her antisocial leisure behaviour and demonstrate their own ideological purity through enthusiastic participation in collective entertainment activities. What strikes me most about these entertainment laws is how they reveal the totalitarian impulse to control not just what people do, but how they feel about what they do. When rulers regulate joy, laughter, and leisure, they're attempting to invade the last private spaces of human experience. Dr. Hannah Arendt, in her study The Origins of Totalitarianism, observed that societies with mandatory entertainment policies often produced populations with severely diminished capacity for genuine emotion. When joy becomes a duty, Arendt noted, it ceases to be joy and becomes another form of labour. The psychological damage extended beyond the immediate victims. When entertainment becomes politically dangerous, entire societies lose their ability to play, relax, and connect with each other through shared pleasure. The social bonds that are normally created through leisure activities become sources of suspicion and fear instead. These stories remind us that the freedom to enjoy ourselves as we choose, to laugh naturally, to play without political implications, and to find happiness in our own ways is a precious liberty that many people throughout history never experienced. Every time you laugh spontaneously, every time you choose your own entertainment without fear of political consequences, every time you play games or enjoy music without worrying about government approval, you're exercising freedoms that countless people died trying to protect. But as twisted as these entertainment laws were, they pale in comparison to the final frontier of royal control we're about to explore. Because when you've regulated joy, controlled faith, and monitored leisure, there's only one realm left to conquer, the realm of money and survival itself. Just ahead, we're diving into tax laws so brutal they make modern taxation look generous, where owing money to the crown could cost not just your wealth but your life, and where some rulers created financial obligations so impossible to fulfill that entire populations were trapped in cycles of debt that led inevitably to death. The terrifying tax laws of royal history will show you that when absolute power meets financial desperation, the results are more devastating than any entertainment could ever distract from. Taxes are never fun, but imagine a world where failing to pay your taxes didn't just mean penalties or jail time. It meant watching your family members be sold into slavery, your children taken as collateral, or your own execution in the public square. Throughout history, some rulers created tax systems so merciless that owing money became a death sentence, and where entire populations were trapped in financial systems designed not to collect revenue, but to destroy lives. Here's something to consider. What's the worst thing that's happened to you for being late with a payment? A late fee? A phone call from a collection agency? Now imagine if being behind on your taxes meant your children could be legally kidnapped by the government, or if your unpaid debts could be inherited by your great-grandchildren, trapping entire bloodlines in eternal financial slavery. We're diving into tax laws so brutal they make modern taxation look like gentle suggestions, where mathematics became murder and bookkeeping became a tool of genocide. Let's start with perhaps the most systematically deadly tax system in history. The Roman Empire's tributum system, under Emperor Diocletian, which didn't just collect money, it collected human lives when money wasn't available. According to the detailed economic analysis by historian Michael Rostovtsev in The Social and Economic History of the Roman Empire, Diocletian's tax reforms in 301 AD created a system where tax debt could be paid in cash, goods, labour, or human beings. Rostovtsev's research reveals that Diocletian's tax laws included provisions for human collateral, the legal seizure of family members when monetary taxes couldn't be paid. But here's the terrifying part. Once someone was taken as tax collateral, they became permanent property of the state, even if the original debt was later paid. According to Rostovtsev's analysis of imperial legal documents, The human collateral system was so systematized that the government maintained detailed valuations for different types of people. Healthy young men were valued at 1,000 denarii toward tax debt. Women were valued at 800 denarii. Children were valued at 500 denarii. Elderly people were considered worthless for tax purposes and were simply abandoned when families couldn't pay. Rostov-Zef documented the case of farmer Gaius Antonius, whose tax debt of 2,500 denarii in 305 AD was paid by surrendering his wife and 2 teenage sons to imperial tax collectors. The family never saw each other again. Gaius lived the rest of his life alone on his farm, working to pay taxes that supported a system that had destroyed his family. Think about this. The Roman government literally had a price list for buying your family members to pay your taxes, but Diocletian's tax system had an even more cruel twist. Rostov-Zef's research shows that tax debts were inherited across generations, creating family bloodlines that were permanently enslaved to the tax system. If your grandfather couldn't pay his taxes, you inherited his debt along with compound interest calculated over decades. Rostov-Zef found records of families who had been paying the same inherited tax debt for over 100 years, with each generation surrendering family members to reduce debt that continued to grow faster than they could pay it. These families became what Rostov-Zef called tax slaves, people who existed solely to serve a financial system designed to consume them. Can you imagine inheriting not just your family's property, but also their unpayable debts that could cost you your children? Now let's journey to medieval England, where King John's tax system became so brutal it literally forced his own nobles to rebel and create the Magna Carta. According to historian James Holt in Magna Carta, John didn't just raise taxes, he created financial penalties so arbitrary and severe that owing money to the crown became more dangerous than open warfare. Holt's research reveals that King John instituted escalating financial penalties that turned minor tax violations into life-destroying catastrophes. The system worked like this. If you were late paying taxes, you owed double the original amount. If you couldn't pay the penalty, it doubled again. If you still couldn't pay, it doubled again, and so on, until the debt became mathematically impossible to settle. But here's where John's system became truly sadistic. According to Holt's analysis of royal financial records, John deliberately set tax deadlines that were impossible to meet, then used the resulting penalties to seize property and eliminate political rivals. Holt documented the case of Baron William de Braos, who owed 40,000 marks in taxes to King John in 1208. When William couldn't pay by the impossible deadline, the debt was doubled to 80,000 marks. When he still couldn't pay, it doubled to 160,000 marks, more money than existed in many entire counties. John used William's impossible debt to justify seizing all of his lands, castles, and property. When William fled to Ireland, John pursued him there and eventually captured William's wife and eldest son. They were imprisoned in Corfe Castle and deliberately starved to death as punishment for the unpaid tax debt. A family was tortured to death because they couldn't pay a tax bill that had been mathematically designed to be unpayable. But King John's tax terror had an even more psychologically devastating aspect. He used tax debt to turn families against each other. Holt's research shows that John offered reduced penalties to family members who would testify against each other about hidden assets or unreported income. Holt found records of sons testifying against fathers, wives informing on husbands, and brothers betraying brothers in exchange for reduced tax penalties. The financial pressure was so extreme that family loyalty became a luxury people couldn't afford. Holt documented a heartbreaking case where merchant Thomas of London testified that his elderly father had hidden gold coins in their family garden. The father was tortured until he revealed the location of coins that barely covered a fraction of their tax debt. Thomas received a small reduction in his penalty, but his father died from the torture, and Thomas lived the rest of his life knowing he'd killed his own father for a handful of coins. Would you be able to resist betraying your family if it meant the difference between financial survival and complete destruction? Let's travel to Imperial China, where the Tang dynasty created tax laws that turned natural disasters into opportunities for financial enslavement. According to historian Denny Twitchett in Financial Administration under the Tang Dynasty, Chinese tax collectors were required to maintain collection rates even during famines, floods, and other catastrophes that made payment impossible. Dr. Twitchett's report reveals that Tang tax laws included disaster debt provisions that required citizens to borrow money from the government to pay taxes during emergencies, with interest rates that ensured the debt could never be repaid. This created a system where natural disasters led inevitably to permanent financial bondage. According to Dr. Twitchett's analysis of Tang financial records, during the Great Famine of 741 AD, tax collectors continued demanding full payment from starving peasants. When people couldn't pay with money they didn't have, they were forced to accept government loans at 100% annual interest to cover their tax obligations. Dr. Twitchett documented that these disaster loans were designed to be unpayable. A peasant family that borrowed 10 strings of cash to pay taxes during the famine would owe 20 strings after 1 year, 40 strings after 2 years, and 80 strings after 3 years. The debt grew exponentially while their ability to pay remained devastated by the original disaster. But here's the cruelest part. Dr. Twitchett's research shows that families who couldn't repay their disaster loans were forced into generational tax servitude, a system where children and grandchildren were legally obligated to work for the government until the family debt was satisfied. Dr. Twitchett found records of families who entered tax servitude during the 741 famine and were still serving the government over 50 years later. Multiple generations were born into bondage because their ancestors had been forced to borrow money to pay taxes during a natural disaster. Think about this. Children were born into slavery because their great-great-grandparents had taken a loan to pay taxes during a famine. Now let's explore medieval France, where the tax system became so oppressive it literally drove the population to cannibalism. According to historian Barbara Tuchman in A Distant Mirror, the French monarchy's tax demands during the 14th century created such extreme poverty that normal social bonds completely collapsed. Tuchman's research reveals that French tax collectors were given quotas that had to be met regardless of economic conditions, crop failures, or population death rates. Tax collection continued even during the Black Death, when half the population was dying of plague. According to Tuchman's documentation, French peasants during this period faced tax rates that consumed 80 to 90% of their total agricultural production. After paying royal taxes, church tithes, and feudal obligations, families were left with barely enough food to survive 1 month out of each year. But the tax system had a provision that made survival even more impossible. Tuchman found evidence of anticipatory taxation, where tax collectors could demand payment for future years if they suspected taxpayers might die or flee before the next collection period. Tuchman documented the village of Montalou, where tax collectors in 1348 demanded 3 years of advanced taxes from peasants who were already starving. When the villagers couldn't pay, tax collectors seized all food stores, livestock, and farming tools, leaving the population with absolutely nothing. The result was what Tuchman called tax-induced social collapse. With no food and no means to produce food, the villagers began eating grass, tree bark, and eventually each other. Tuchman found church records documenting cases of cannibalism that were directly attributed to tax-induced starvation. Parents ate their own children because the tax system had taken literally everything else. Can you imagine a tax system so brutal that it drove ordinary people to cannibalism just to survive? Let's journey to the Aztec Empire, where tax collection became a form of ritualized warfare that was designed more to terrorize than to generate revenue. According to historian Ross Hassig in Aztec Warfare, Imperial Expansion and Political Control, Aztec tax collection was intentionally violent and traumatic to maintain psychological control over conquered populations. Dr. Hassig's research reveals that Aztec tax laws required tribute payments that were mathematically impossible for many communities to fulfill, creating justification for military intervention and human sacrifice. The tax system was designed to fail, providing pretexts for continued domination. According to Dr. Hassig's analysis of Aztec tribute records, conquered cities were required to provide specific quotas of goods, services, and human beings for sacrifice. But here's the terrifying part. The quotas were deliberately set higher than the communities could possibly produce, ensuring that tax collection would always involve violence. Dr. Hassig documented the tribute requirements for the city of Tlatelolco. 400 blankets, 400 women's garments, 1,600 loads of firewood, 8,000 sheets of paper, and 20 live warriors for sacrifice, all to be delivered every 80 days. The mathematical requirements made compliance impossible, which was exactly the point. When Tlatelolco inevitably failed to meet these impossible quotas, Aztec tax collectors arrived with military forces to collect the shortfall through violence. Dr. Hassig found records showing that tax collection raids often resulted in the capture of hundreds of people who were taken to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice. But the Aztec tax system had an even more psychologically devastating element. It required communities to participate in selecting which of their own members would be sacrificed to cover tax shortfalls. Dr. Hassig's research shows that Aztec tax laws forced local leaders to choose which families would lose children to satisfy tribute requirements. Hassig documented the psychological trauma this created in subject communities. Local leaders who had to select sacrifice victims often committed suicide from guilt and despair. Communities became paralyzed by suspicion and fear as neighbors wondered who might be selected for sacrifice to cover the next tax shortfall. Think about this. Tax collectors forced parents to decide which of their neighbors' children should be killed to satisfy government revenue requirements. Now let's return to more recent history, where Stalinist tax policy in the Soviet Union created artificial famines that killed millions of people in pursuit of impossible agricultural quotas. According to historian Robert Conquest in The Harvest of Sorrow, Stalin's tax demands on Ukrainian peasants were deliberately set at levels that would cause mass starvation. Conquest's research reveals that Soviet agricultural taxation wasn't designed to collect reasonable revenue. It was designed to break the resistance of independent farmers and force them into collective agricultural systems. The tax quotas were mathematical weapons of genocide. According to Conquest's analysis of Soviet state archives, Ukrainian peasants in 1932 were required to surrender 95% of their grain production to the state as agricultural tax. This left families with essentially no food for the winter, creating conditions for mass starvation. But here's the most criminal aspect. Conquest found evidence that Stalin's government knew exactly what the tax quotas would accomplish. Internal Soviet documents show that party officials calculated that the tax demands would cause the death of approximately 3 to 5 million Ukrainian peasants, and they proceeded anyway. Conquest documented that when Ukrainian villages couldn't meet their impossible tax quotas, Soviet tax collectors sealed the villages to prevent anyone from leaving to find food. Families were forced to watch their children starve, while grain rotted in government warehouses. The Holodomor, as this artificial famine came to be known, killed an estimated 6 to 8 million people between 32 and 33. It was genocide accomplished through tax policy, the systematic murder of a population through impossible financial demands. What strikes me most about these tax systems is how they reveal the fundamental relationship between financial control and human survival. When governments can destroy families through financial demands, they hold power over the most basic human needs: food, shelter, and safety. Dr. Charles Tilly, in his study Coercion, Capital, and European States, every time you pay taxes without fear of losing your family, every time you face financial difficulties without worrying about execution, every time you live in a system where monetary debt doesn't become a death sentence, you're benefiting from protections that countless people throughout history never experienced. These tax terror stories show us that economic freedom and personal liberty are inseparably linked. When governments can destroy lives through financial demands, no other freedoms can truly exist, because the threat of economic annihilation makes all other rights meaningless. But after exploring all these different forms of royal control, from dining rules to tax terror, there's one rule we haven't yet encountered that surpasses them all in its sheer audacity and world-changing impact. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through royal madness, we're about to discover the most shocking rule of all, a law so unprecedented, so revolutionary, and so completely unexpected that it didn't just change one kingdom, but altered the entire course of human civilization forever. This ultimate royal rule will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, authority, and the relationship between rulers and the ruled. After witnessing 14 chapters of royal madness, rulers who controlled every breath, every step, every thought of their subjects, prepare yourself for the most shocking rule in human history. A law so revolutionary, so completely opposite to everything we've seen, that it didn't just change one kingdom, it rewrote the entire blueprint for civilization and created the foundation for every freedom we enjoy today. But here's what will amaze you. This rule wasn't about taking more control, it was about voluntarily giving it up. This wasn't about demanding more obedience, it was about granting unprecedented freedom. And the ruler who created it became the most powerful emperor in the ancient world, precisely because he chose to be the least controlling. We're talking about Cyrus the Great of Persia and his revolutionary freedom of conscience edict of 539 BC, a law so radical that it makes modern human rights declarations look timid by comparison. According to the detailed translation by historian Maria Brozius in The Persians, an Introduction, when Cyrus conquered Babylon, he did something that no conqueror in history had ever done before. Instead of imposing Persian customs, religion, and laws on the defeated population, he issued an edict declaring that all peoples in his empire had the right to worship their own gods, follow their own customs, and govern themselves according to their own traditions. But here's what made this truly revolutionary. Brozius's research shows that Cyrus didn't just tolerate other cultures, he actively protected and funded them. The famous Cyrus cylinder, preserved in the British Museum, documents that Cyrus used imperial treasury funds to rebuild temples of foreign gods, restore local customs that previous conquerors had banned, and even repatriate peoples who had been enslaved by earlier empires. The most famous example was Cyrus's liberation of the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity. According to the biblical account in the Book of Ezra, confirmed by Babylonian historical records analysed by Brozius, Cyrus not only freed the Jewish exiles but paid for them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Think about this. At a time when every other ruler demanded religious submission, Cyrus voluntarily funded the religious practices of people who worshipped completely different gods. But Cyrus's tolerance went far beyond religion. Brosius's research reveals that the Persian Empire allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own legal systems, speak their own languages, and even keep their local rulers in power as long as they remained peaceful members of the empire. According to the administrative records translated by Brosius, the Persian Empire became a confederation of autonomous regions rather than a centralized tyranny. Local governors, called satraps, were required to respect local customs and laws. Imperial interference in local affairs was strictly forbidden, except in cases of rebellion or external threat. The result was stunning. Cyrus created the largest empire in human history up to that point, not through oppression, but through liberation. According to Brosius's analysis, the Persian Empire at its height controlled over 40% of the world's population, yet maintained internal peace for over 200 years, because people chose to remain part of it rather than being forced to submit to it. But here's the most shocking part. Cyrus's tolerance wasn't just a political strategy, it was a moral philosophy that he believed was divinely mandated. The Cyrus cylinder includes the declaration that Ahura Mazda, the Persian god, had commanded Cyrus to gather all the scattered peoples and restore them to their homes. Cyrus believed that forced conversion and cultural oppression were sins against the divine order of the universe. He saw diversity as a reflection of divine creativity rather than a threat to imperial unity. This philosophy created what historian Tom Holland, in Persian Fire, calls the first truly multicultural civilization. Holland's research shows that the Persian Empire became a place where Greek philosophers studied alongside Babylonian astronomers, where Jewish scholars debated with Zoroastrian priests, and where Egyptian artists collaborated with Persian craftsmen. The Persian court in Persepolis became what we might recognize today as the first international cosmopolitan center, where merit and wisdom mattered more than ethnic background or religious affiliation. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Cyrus's rule was his approach to succession and power transfer. According to Holland's documentation, Cyrus established legal mechanisms that prevented his successors from becoming tyrants. The Persian royal law included provisions that required kings to consult with nobles, respect local customs, and maintain the tolerance policies that had made the empire successful. Holland found evidence that Cyrus deliberately created checks on royal power because he believed that absolute authority corrupted even well-intentioned rulers. The Persian system included councils, legal appeals processes, and cultural protections that limited what even the emperor could do. This stands in shocking contrast to every other rule we've explored tonight. While other monarchs were creating laws to increase their control over subjects, Cyrus was creating laws to limit his own power and protect his subjects from future tyranny. The impact of Cyrus's revolutionary approach extended far beyond his own empire. According to classical historian Pierre Briant in From Cyrus to Alexander, the Persian model of tolerant governance influenced Greek democracy, Roman law, and eventually every major political system that valued individual rights and cultural diversity. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, he adopted many of Cyrus's tolerance policies. When Romans encountered Persian administrative methods, they incorporated respect for local customs into their own imperial system. When Islamic empires expanded, they often used Persian models of religious tolerance and cultural autonomy. Briant's research shows that the concept of religious freedom, cultural rights, and limited government, ideas we consider fundamental to modern civilization, can all be traced back to Cyrus's revolutionary edicts of 539 BC. But here's what makes Cyrus's story even more remarkable. He succeeded precisely because he chose restraint over control. While other rulers were destroying themselves through excessive tyranny, Cyrus built the most stable, prosperous, and long-lasting empire in the ancient world by voluntarily limiting his own power. The Persian Empire lasted for over 20 years, longer than most modern nations have existed, because it was built on consent rather than compulsion, diversity rather than uniformity, and freedom rather than fear. Think about this profound irony. The ruler who demanded the least absolute obedience achieved the most absolute success. The king who gave away the most power became the most powerful leader in his world. Cyrus's example shows us something hopeful about human nature and political power. Sustainable authority comes not from the ability to control others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that control. True strength lies not in forcing compliance, but in inspiring cooperation. After 14 chapters of royal madness, Cyrus the Great reminds us that there has always been an alternative to tyranny. Even in the ancient world, some leaders understood that power shared is power multiplied, that diversity strengthens rather than weakens society, and that the best way to rule people is to help them rule themselves. Every freedom we enjoy today, religious liberty, cultural rights, the ability to speak our own languages and follow our own customs, traces back to a Persian king who chose compassion over control, wisdom over whim, and liberation over domination. As we conclude this incredible journey through the strangest royal rules in history, remember this. We've seen how power can corrupt, how control can consume, and how tyranny can destroy both rulers and ruled. But we've also seen that even in the darkest periods of human history, there were leaders who chose a better path. The choice between tyranny and freedom, between control and compassion, between fear and hope, is one that every generation must make for itself. The stories we've shared tonight remind us that freedom is never guaranteed, never automatic, and never safe from those who would sacrifice human dignity for political power. But they also remind us that human dignity has always found champions, even in the most unlikely places. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to treat other people as human beings worthy of respect, freedom, and the right to live according to their own consciences. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary journey through the strangest royal rules in history. These stories of human triumph and tragedy, of wisdom and madness, of cruelty and compassion, remind us that history is not just about the past. It's about understanding the choices that shape our present and our future. Until our next adventure together, remember that every day you live in freedom, every choice you make without fear, every word you speak without looking over your shoulder is a victory won by people throughout history who refused to accept that tyranny was humanity's natural condition. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most shocking rule of all might just be the one that sets people free.